Well, hello there, my friend. If you have already turned the lights down low and pulled the blanket up to your chin, then you're exactly where you need to be right now. Get comfortable. Tonight's story starts with a house, a very strange house, and a widow that an entire nation was absolutely convinced had lost her mind. Picture a mansion with a staircase that climbs 7 full steps directly into a ceiling, a door on the 2nd floor that opens onto nothing but open air and a very long drop, hallways that curve back on themselves like they were designed by someone who never ever wanted to be found. For almost 4 decades, the sound of hammers never really stopped inside those walls. The woman behind it all became one of the richest widows in the country, and every newspaper in America was certain of one thing: she had built her fortune into a monument to madness. But here's the question we're going to sit with tonight. What if that maze was never built to trap ghosts inside? What if it was built to keep the rest of the world out? Before we step through those gates, though, do me one small favour. If the kind of story that gets under your skin a little is exactly what you came here for, go ahead and tap that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment down below so I know you're here with me. Tell me where you're tucked in tonight and what time it is right there where you are. I read every single one of them, and truthfully, my favourite part of this whole thing is finding out how many different corners of the world are winding down together at the exact same moment. Now go ahead and dim the lights just a little more if you can. Maybe let a fan hum quietly in the background. Get settled in, and let's go find out what really happened inside that house. Our story does not begin in that sprawling, tangled mansion. It begins somewhere much smaller, much quieter in New Haven, Connecticut, back in the early 1800s. There was a young woman there named Sarah Pardee, and by every account that survives her, she was the kind of person a room noticed the moment she walked into it. She spoke French fluently. She composed music. Neighbours called her the Belle of New Haven, which, if you think about it, is a fairly high bar to clear in a town full of Yale professors and shipping fortunes. She was sharp, curious, and by most descriptions, quietly funny in the way that clever people often are when they know they're the smartest one at the dinner table, but are far too polite to say so out loud. In 1862, she married a young man named William Wirt Winchester. His father, Oliver Winchester, had built a company that started out of all things making men's dress shirts. Then the Civil War arrived, and the family's shirt-making machinery turned out to be remarkably good at manufacturing something else entirely. Rifles. Repeating rifles, to be exact, the kind that could fire again and again without reloading after every single shot. By the time Sarah married into the family, the Winchester name was already becoming a small empire. For a few years, life seemed to move the way it was supposed to. In 1866, Sarah gave birth to a daughter and she named her Annie. But Annie was born with a condition that kept her from thriving, and within about a month she was gone. Sarah never had another child. If you've ever lost someone before you even really got the chance to know them, you already understand that particular kind of grief. It doesn't always look loud from the outside. Sometimes it just quietly rearranges everything underneath. Sarah carried that loss for 14 years. And then in the span of about 6 months, life did something almost unbelievable. Between the fall of 1880 and the spring of 1881, she lost her mother. She lost her father-in-law Oliver, the man who had built the entire company. And then she lost her husband William to tuberculosis. 3 people. Half a year. Imagine standing at the edge of a life you thought you understood, and watching nearly all of it disappear within a matter of months. At 41 years old, Sarah Winchester was suddenly one of the wealthiest widows on earth. She inherited a fortune along with 50% ownership of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and she would keep collecting profits from every rifle the company sold for the rest of her life. By some estimates, her daily income from that inheritance alone came out to something like $1,000 a day, at a time when a factory worker might not see that much money in an entire year. And yet here is the strange, quiet truth about grief that nobody warns you about. Money doesn't touch it, not even close. She was one of the richest women alive, and by every account she was also one of the loneliest. Now this is the part where legend and history start pulling in two very different directions, so let's walk through both, because the gap between them tells you almost everything you need to know about how the world treats grieving women. The legend goes like this. Devastated and desperate, Sarah supposedly travelled to consult a medium back east, someone who claimed to speak with the dead. And according to the story, this medium told her something chilling, that her family was cursed by the spirits of everyone who had ever been killed by a Winchester rifle, and that the only way to survive was to move west and build a house for herself and for them, forever. The moment she stopped building, the story goes, is the moment she would die. It is a wonderful story. It has been turned into novels, comic books, a Hollywood film with Helen Mirren, and roughly 1,000 ghost tour scripts. There's just one small problem with it. There is no actual evidence that any of it happened. Here's what we do know. In 1884, at 45 years old, grieving and likely worn down by years of watching family members waste away from illness, Sarah's doctor suggested a change of climate might do her some good. So she travelled, spending time abroad, and eventually made her way out to California, where her sisters had already settled. In 1886, she purchased a modest 8-room farmhouse on 45 acres near San Jose. She named it Lanada Villa, and then she started to build. Picture it for a moment. A woman in her mid-40s, still dressed in mourning black years after everyone would have quietly expected her to move on, standing in the middle of an unfinished room with rolls of drawings under one arm, giving instructions to a crew of carpenters who had learned by then never to ask why. The scratch of pencil on paper by candlelight, the smell of fresh-cut redwood, the steady, almost musical rhythm of hammers that her neighbours could hear from down the road morning after morning, year after year, until the sounds simply became part of the landscape like birdsong or the wind coming off the valley. What began as small renovations never really stopped. Room after room, floor after floor for the next 36 years until her death in 1922. At its peak, before disaster struck, the house rose 7 stories into the California sky. It eventually contained somewhere around 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, 6 kitchens, and 10,000 windows. Many of them custom stained glass, some designed with a level of craftsmanship you would expect in a cathedral. Not a farmhouse that had gone slightly wonderfully out of control. And it was strange, delightfully, almost stubbornly strange. There are staircases with steps only 2 inches high built that way historians now believe to ease the pain in Sarah's arthritic joints. There are doors that open onto blank walls and a stairway that ends abruptly at a ceiling with no landing above it. There's a drainage system built into the floor of an indoor conservatory. There's a chimney that rises 4 stories and simply stops short of the roof, almost as if it changed its mind halfway up. If you've ever tried to assemble a piece of furniture without instructions and ended up with 3 mystery screws left over and a nagging feeling you missed a step, you have some idea of the confidence and the chaos we're dealing with here. And remember, this was a woman fluent in French, trained in music composition, sharp enough to manage her own fortune at a time when most banks would barely speak to a woman without a husband's signature sitting right next to hers. For decades, the popular story painted Sarah as a superstitious, half-mad recluse, wandering her endless halls in mourning black, communing with spirits in a hidden seance room, terrified to ever put down the hammer. The truth that has emerged from letters, business records, and the accounts of people who actually knew her tells a very different story. She was by nearly every first-hand description sharp, kind, financially savvy and clear-headed well into old age. She managed a fortune personally instead of handing it to a man to manage for her, which in the late 1800s was itself considered somewhat scandalous behaviour for a woman. She designed rooms herself, sketching out plans. Working closely with a crew of carpenters she kept employed for years at wages well above the going rate, during a time when many of her wealthy peers barely acknowledged their household staff existed. She stopped construction constantly, by the way, which rather undercuts the whole never put down the hammer legend. Work paused for months at a time whenever she travelled or grew tired of a particular design, and in 1906 a massive earthquake tore through the region, collapsing her grand 7-story tower and much of the top floors. She had the wreckage cleared away, and then quietly she chose not to rebuild that part of the house at all. If Sarah truly believed some vengeful supernatural force required endless construction to keep her alive, you would think an earthquake practically ordering her to stop would have been treated as something close to a death sentence. Instead, she just moved on with her life for another 16 years. 2 years after her passing, the famous magician Harry Houdini visited the house, determined to expose the whole haunted mansion story as nonsense. He left by his own account more confused than when he arrived, and it was Houdini himself who reportedly coined the nickname that stuck ever since, the Mystery House. Which brings us to the uncomfortable part of the story. 9 months after Sarah died, the new owners of her home opened it to the public as a tourist attraction. And a strange sprawling mansion built by an eccentric, brilliant widow is a fine story, but a haunted mansion built by a guilt-ridden madwoman fleeing angry ghosts, that sells tickets. So the legend was polished, exaggerated, and sold at the gift shop for the next 100 years, while the actual woman quietly disappeared underneath it. So let's ask the question again now that we know a little more. Why did Sarah Winchester keep building? Maybe it wasn't fear at all. Maybe for the first time in her entire adult life, absolutely no one could tell her to stop. Not a husband, not a father-in-law, not the polite, suffocating rules of Gilded Age society that expected a grieving woman to shrink quietly into the background and wait, patiently, to become irrelevant. Widowhood had taken almost everyone she loved, but it had also strangely handed her something she had perhaps never fully had before. Complete uncontested ownership over her own decisions, every single one of them. She used that freedom to build something with no blueprint, no rulebook, and absolutely no one's permission required. It just happened to look like a labyrinth from the outside, because nobody had ever handed her a floor plan for what a free woman's life was even supposed to look like. Maybe you felt some small version of that yourself. That strange, disorienting moment after a loss or an ending, or just a long chapter finally closing, when the grief is still very much there but so quietly as a question nobody prepares you for. Now what? Sarah Winchester answered that question with redwood and stained glass and 36 years of hammers. Most of us will never build anything quite that strange. But the instinct underneath it, the need to build something, anything entirely on our own terms after everything falls apart, that part might be more familiar than we'd like to admit. And that, it turns out, was not unique to Sarah at all. It was the strange, quiet secret sitting underneath an entire era. Because to really understand how a grieving widow ended up with that kind of power in the first place, we need to talk about something she and every widow like her was required to put on the very morning her husband died. A uniform, one dictated by rules stricter in some ways than actual law. A dress of a very particular black worn for a very particular length of time, that the whole of society agreed meant one thing on the surface, and as we're about to find out meant something else entirely underneath. Here's something that almost never makes it into the history books. And it should. On the morning after her husband died, a widow in the late 1800s did not get to grieve quietly in her own clothes for even a single day. Within hours, sometimes before the body had even been moved out of the house, someone was already measuring her for a new wardrobe. Because grief, it turned out, had a dress code, and breaking it was treated less like a fashion mistake and more like a small act of rebellion. Let's talk about that dress code for a moment, because once you understand it, a lot of what we just walked through about Sarah Winchester starts to make even more sense. And honestly, once you hear the details, you may never look at an old black and white photograph of a stern-faced widow quite the same way again. It started more or less with one grieving queen an ocean away. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria did not simply mourn him. She built an entire second reign around it. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She kept his shaving supplies laid out fresh every single morning as though he might walk back in and use them. And because she was the most photographed, most talked about woman on earth at the time, her grief became fashion. Her sorrow became a look. Within a decade, that look had crossed the Atlantic and settled into American parlours, etiquette columns and department store catalogues, whether the average American widow had ever thought about the Queen of England for a single minute of her life or not. Here's roughly how it worked, and I want you to really picture the timeline because it's stricter than almost anything we'd tolerate today. Etiquette manuals with names like Cassell's Household Guide and the Lady's Book of Etiquette spelled it out in exacting detail right down to the stitch. A widow was expected to spend the first stretch, often described precisely as 1 year and a day, in what was called full mourning, with the entire period stretching closer to 2 years before she was considered fully returned to ordinary life. Every stitch of visible clothing had to be black. Not just any black either. It had to be dull, flat, completely without shine, which meant silk was out and a stiff, scratchy fabric called crepe was in. No lace. No jewellery except for pieces made from a coal-like black stone called jet, or occasionally jewellery woven from the actual hair of the person who had died. Which sounds unsettling to modern ears, I know, but at a time when photographs were expensive and rare, a lock of hair sealed inside a locket was often the only physical piece of someone a family had left. A heavy black veil covered her face in public for months, and she was expected to decline nearly every social invitation that came her way. No parties, no theatre, no dinners. Church and only church was considered acceptable. Now compare that to what was expected of a man who lost his wife during that exact same era. A black armband, maybe a black hatband if he was feeling especially devoted. He could go back to work the following Monday, and if he remarried within the year, which happened often, society barely raised an eyebrow. I think that gap tells you almost everything you need to know about whose grief society actually believed was real, and whose was simply expected to be decorative. I want to slow down on that hair jewellery detail for a second because I think it deserves more than a passing mention. Women of the era would take a lock of hair from a husband, a child, sometimes an entire family, and weave it, braid it, coil it into intricate patterns, then seal it under glass inside a brooch, a ring or a bracelet worn every single day. To our eyes now that can look almost gothic. But think about what these women were actually working with. No smartphones full of photographs, no voice memos to replay. In a lot of households, no photograph of the person at all. A woven strand of hair sitting against her wrist was quite simply the closest thing to still being able to touch someone who was gone. I'll be honest, when I first read about this, I judged it as strange. The more I sat with it, the more it just struck me as tender. Would you keep something like that if it was all you had left? I think a lot of us already do keep things exactly like it. We just don't call it mourning jewellery anymore. Etiquette writers of the day got remarkably specific about all of this, to the point where it almost stops sounding like fashion and starts sounding like instructions for defusing a bomb. There were entire passages devoted to the correct fabric for each stage. Bombazine, a dull twilled silk and wool blend with absolutely no shine to it, was considered acceptable. So was something called Henrietta cloth. Anything that caught the light, anything glossy or bright, was treated almost as a small betrayal of the person who had died. Even buttons had rules. A shiny button could get a woman talked about at church. On top of the dress itself, a widow in full mourning wore a stiff white cap under her veil, and the veil itself could be so heavy and so dark that some accounts describe women struggling to see clearly enough to walk down a staircase without help. Which, if you think about it for a second, is a fairly dangerous design flaw to build into an outfit meant to be worn for an entire year. After that first long stretch came what etiquette books of the time called half-mourning, a kind of probationary period, where a widow could finally introduce a bit of grey lavender or soft mauve into her wardrobe, still trimmed with black, still restrained, but at least no longer head to toe in crepe. And it did not stop at clothing either. If a widow needed to write a letter during that first year, even her stationery was expected to mourn along with her. Writing paper and envelopes came edged in a thick black border, and the deeper into full mourning she was, the wider that border needed to be, gradually narrowing as the months passed, like a slowly healing wound printed right there in the corner of every page. Calling cards worked the same way. If she left one at a friend's home, its black edge announced her situation before a single word was spoken. I find that detail almost unbearably sad and a little bit funny at the same time, because somewhere out there, a stationer was standing behind a counter, asking a brand new widow exactly how wide she would like her grief printed today. Here's the part that really surprised me when I first looked into this. In America, there was never actually a law demanding any of it. No government office ever wrote these rules down and stamped them official. Etiquette writers of the time openly admitted as much, noting that no fixed periods for mourning dress had ever been legally established in the United States. And yet in practice, the social penalty for stepping out of black too early could feel far heavier than any actual fine. One widely read etiquette column of the era went so far as to say that a widow who set aside her mourning and returned to ordinary society within less than a year would simply be seen as lacking in good taste, full stop. No court, no statute, no officer of the law. Just an entire society quietly agreeing to police her wardrobe for her, which in some ways is a far more effective enforcement system than any actual rulebook could ever be. And here's a detail I find almost darkly funny once you sit with it. There was really only one company manufacturing most of the crepe fabric used across the entire mourning industry in the English-speaking world at the time, a firm called Courtaulds. One company essentially cornering the market on a fabric that an entire grieving population was more or less required by social pressure to buy over and over again, because it was considered bad luck to keep mourning fabric in the house once your official mourning period had ended, which meant every fresh loss in a family meant a fresh trip to buy more. Grief quite literally had a supply chain. Somewhere out there was a factory owner who never had to worry about demand drying up, because people unfortunately never stop dying. For a family of modest means, all of this could be quietly ruinous. Outfitting a household in proper mourning, sometimes including the servants, could cost more than some families spent on food in a month, and yet showing up underdressed for grief carried its own social punishment. People noticed. People talked. There was an unspoken, deeply cruel calculation running underneath all of it. Your visible sorrow needed to match your visible wealth, or people quietly assumed you either didn't love the person enough or couldn't afford to prove that you did. It got so widely acknowledged as a financial burden that by the 1870s, reformers on both sides of the Atlantic were actively campaigning for simpler, cheaper funerals and mourning wardrobes, encouraging families to dye an existing dress black rather than buy a new one entirely. We're going to spend a lot more time later in this story on the women who never had Sarah Winchester's fortune behind them, the ones expected to perform this same grief with none of the money required to do it properly. But for now, just hold on to that thought. The rules were the same on paper for every widow, rich or poor. The consequences of following them were not. So here is the question I keep circling back to, and I would honestly love to know what you think about this one. Was any of this really about grief at all? Or was it about performance? Because if a woman's sorrow had to be measured in yards of specific fabric and months on a calendar, then what we're actually talking about isn't emotion. It's theatre with a very strict costume department. But here's where the story does something I did not expect the first time I really dug into it, and it's the part that ties directly back into a woman like Sarah Winchester, quietly rebuilding her entire life behind that same black veil. Because that suffocating uniform designed on paper to shrink a woman down to keep her indoors silent and small accidentally handed her something else entirely. A kind of camouflage. Think about it from the inside for a second. A young unmarried woman walking through a train station alone in 1885 would draw stares, questions, maybe even outright harassment. A married woman doing the same thing without her husband present might invite gossip about where he was and why she was unsupervised. But a widow veiled head to toe in black, moving briskly and alone through that same train station. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her. She could walk into a bank and ask about her own accounts. She could sit across a desk from a lawyer, a land agent, or a building contractor, and be taken seriously simply because there was quite obviously no husband left to redirect the conversation toward. In a strange backwards way, that costume of total visible sorrow was one of the only outfits a woman could wear in public that came with almost no social interrogation attached to it at all. She had become in the eyes of a very nosy society invisible, and if you have ever wanted to disappear from a room full of expectations, even for just an afternoon, you already understand exactly how valuable that kind of invisibility can be. There's another layer to this that I think gets missed constantly. That mandatory mourning period was also, whether anyone admitted it out loud or not, the only socially acceptable way a woman of that era could simply say no. No to dinner invitations she never wanted to attend. No to suitors already circling before her husband was even properly buried, and trust me, that happened far more often than most people realize. No to family obligations, social calls, and the endless performance of Gilded Age politeness. For one specific stretch of her life, a widow had built in unquestionable permission to close the door and be left entirely alone. Nobody could call that rude. It was technically the rule. I'd argue we still do a quieter version of this today, honestly. We don't have crepe and jet jewellery anymore, but we absolutely still have unspoken timelines for grief. How soon is too soon to smile again in public? How soon is too soon to start dating? How soon before people start whispering that you've moved on faster than you should have, or just as often that you haven't moved on fast enough? We just don't write the rules down in an etiquette book and sell you the fabric to prove you're following them. We do it in comment sections instead, or in the careful little captions people write, under a photograph explaining, almost apologizing for looking happy again. The costume changed. The judgment sitting underneath it really did not travel nearly as far as we'd like to think. So by the time a woman emerged from those 2 long years fully out of black and back into colour, she had lived through something almost paradoxical. Society had spent that entire stretch of time working very hard to make her small, quiet and invisible. And in doing exactly that, it had handed her completely by accident a rare and narrow window of real unsupervised independence. She could travel without a chaperone raising questions. She could conduct her own affairs without a husband glancing over her shoulder. She could decline nearly any invitation without a single person daring to argue with her. Which brings us to something even stranger sitting just beneath the surface of all that black fabric. Because the dress was never really the whole story. It was just the visible part. Underneath it sat something far more unusual and far more powerful, something written, not into etiquette manuals, but into actual law. A set of rules that decided quite literally whether a woman legally existed as her own person at all, or simply as an extension of whichever man happened to be standing next to her. And the strange truth is, for most women in that century, there was only one door that led to full legal personhood. It didn't open when she turned 18. It didn't open when she got married. For an enormous number of women, it only opened the moment she became a widow and were about to walk straight through that door together. Try this thought experiment with me for a second, because I promise it is stranger than it sounds. Imagine that the moment you got married, you legally stopped existing as your own person. Not physically, obviously. You could still walk, talk, raise children, run a household. But on paper, in the eyes of every court in the land, you and your spouse became one single legal person, and that one legal person was by definition your husband. Your name could still appear on things. Your identity, as far as the law was concerned, simply could not. That was not a metaphor. That was the actual literal legal reality for married women across the English-speaking world, for the better part of 2 centuries, right through most of the era we've been talking about tonight. There was even a name for it borrowed from old French law. A married woman was called a femme covert, which translates more or less to a covered woman. Covered by her husband. Legally hidden underneath him the way a shadow disappears the moment it lines up exactly behind the thing casting it. Here is what that actually meant in practice. And I think it is worth sitting with the details, because it is easy to hear a phrase like legal doctrine and let your brain gently switch off. A married woman could not own property in her own name, even property she had personally earned or inherited before the wedding. The instant she said her vows, whatever she brought into that marriage, land savings, jewellery, even wages she earned afterward from her own labour, legally transferred into her husband's control. She could not sign a binding contract on her own. She could not sue anyone in court, nor could anyone sue her directly, because legally there was no her to sue, only the unit of the marriage represented by him. Some records from the period note almost as enough to thought that a husband could give away or gamble away property his wife had brought into the marriage entirely without her consent, and there was no meaningful legal path for her to stop him. Even something as small and personal as her own clothing sat in a legal grey area. Technically, under strict coverture, the dress on her back belonged to the marital estate her husband controlled, not to her individually. In practice, of course, no husband was marching down to court demanding his wife's bonnet back. But the principle underneath it is what matters here, and it is a strange one to sit with. A woman's body could walk around fully clothed in society, while almost nothing she was wearing legally belonged to her as an individual person. If a copyright existed on a piece of writing she published before marriage, that too transferred to her husband the moment she said her vows. Her name, her labour, her creative work, all of it quietly rerouted into a single male ledger the instant a minister pronounced them married. There was one small crack of protection built into all of this called the doctrine of necessities, and I actually find it kind of darkly funny once you picture it playing out. If a husband failed to provide his wife with food, clothing, or basic essentials appropriate to their standing, she was legally permitted to run up charges at the local shops and taverns in his name, and he was on the hook to pay for it. Picture that for a second. A woman who legally could not own a single coin outright, but who could absolutely walk into a shop and rack up a bill her husband was forced to cover if he was neglecting her. It was less a right and more a leash, with just enough slack in it to keep her from starving. Small comfort, but apparently it was the comfort available. Now here comes the part that turns this entire story on its head. The instant that husband died, something remarkable happened to the woman standing at his graveside in that black crepe we talked about a little earlier. She did not lose her legal personhood along with him. She got it back. All of it, more or less, overnight. Unmarried women had always held this status too, by the way, called femme sole, meaning literally a woman alone. But most women in that century did not stay unmarried for long, so widowhood became for an enormous number of them the very first time in adult life they experienced it. As a widow, she could suddenly own property outright in her own name. She could sign a lease, a deed, a business contract and have it hold up in court exactly as if a man had signed it. She could sue someone who wronged her and be sued in return, which, strange as it sounds, is actually a marker of full legal existence rather than a burden. She could write a will and decide for the first time in her life exactly where her own belongings would go after she died instead of that decision, defaulting automatically to her husband's wishes. She could serve as the executor of an estate managing money and property on behalf of an entire family, a role many men of the era assumed only another man could responsibly handle. Picture it playing out in a real courthouse for a moment. A widow walks in, veiled alone, no father, no brother, no husband standing beside her to vouch for her competence. She sits down across from a clerk to formally register as the administrator of her own late husband's estate. 12 months earlier, that same clerk would have legally been forbidden from recognizing her signature on anything more significant than a church donation. Now he has no choice but to treat her word, her handwriting, and her decisions as fully binding. You can find plenty of grumbling in newspaper columns and etiquette commentary, from the period about widows becoming an increasingly common sight in banks' land offices and courtrooms handling their own affairs without a man standing in for them. The tone of that grumbling tells you almost everything. As if a woman managing money that was by every measure already hers was some kind of unwelcome new trend, rather than basic fairness finally catching up to reality a few decades too late. There is a research detail here that I found strangely moving. Historians studying Old English and American records have noticed that in eras with high adult mortality, plenty of women cycled back and forth between these two legal states multiple times across a single lifetime. Femme sole as a girl, femme covert the moment she married, femme sole again the moment she was widowed, femme covert again if she remarried. Some women lived through that cycle 3, even 4 times before they died, gaining and losing full legal selfhood again and again, depending entirely on whether a wedding ring happened to be on her finger that particular year. Try to imagine living that. Signing your name freely at 20, losing that right at 22, getting it back tangled up with grief at 35, losing it again at 37 because you remarried for financial safety rather than love. Your legal identity was not a fixed thing you carried through life like your name or your height. It flickered on and off like a light switch someone else kept flipping, and the switch happened to be a wedding ring. Let's talk about property specifically for a moment, because there is a piece of this that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Even during marriage, the law did carve out one small guarantee for a wife called dower, a tradition so old it stretched back through medieval English common law, long before anyone in America had ever built a farmhouse. It entitled a widow to a life interest in 1/3 of her late husband's real estate, if there were children, or 1/2 if there were none. Picture a modest farm widow somewhere in rural Ohio or Pennsylvania around this time. Her husband dies, and dower guarantees she will not simply be thrown off the land. But look closely at the fine print. It was only a life estate, not ownership. She could farm it, rent it out, live off the income it produced for the rest of her life. But she could not sell it, could not leave it to her own children in her will. And the moment she died, it reverted automatically to her husband's heirs, whether or not those heirs had ever lifted a finger to help her survive on it. It was protection with an expiration date stamped invisibly onto it from day one. If you're watching this from somewhere across the Atlantic, this will sound familiar with a slightly different accent. The exact same logic of dower and coverture governed most of Britain and its former colonies for the same stretch of the century, which is part of why so many novels from that side of the ocean, the kind full of country estates and anxious inheritances, spend so much time worrying over which widow gets which cottage, and for how long. It was not simply dramatic invention. It was the actual legal weather everyone in that world was living under. And here is a detail that complicates the story even further, one I think deserves honesty rather than a tidy bow tied around it. Even with all of this restored legal personhood, a widow with young children did not automatically gain full unquestioned control over them. Under the law of the period, her children were technically classified as orphans the instant their father died, regardless of whether their mother was standing right there alive and capable. If a widow was poor enough, local authorities in some places held the power to bind her children out as apprentices or servants in other households, without requiring her consent simply because the town did not want the financial burden of supporting them. Sit with that for a second. A mother fully alive, fully willing, fully loving, and the law still found a way to treat her children as though they belonged to no one in particular. So let's be honest about what this freedom actually was. It was real, it was significant, but it was also deeply unequal, generous to a woman with money and land, and often cruelly thin for a woman without either. If you had lived back then, do you think that gap would have made you angrier at the law, or more determined to climb out from under it? I suspect for a lot of these women it was both at once. It took a slow state-by-state crawl of legislation to even partially close that gap for married women, the ones who had not yet been widowed and were still living entirely under coverture. The very first Married Women's Property Act in America appeared in Mississippi in 1839 largely as a narrow financial technicality rather than any grand feminist statement. The law that really got noticed came out of New York in 1848, finally allowing a married woman to keep property in her own name during marriage. And here is a detail I love pointing out because it rarely gets connected in most retellings. That same year, in a small town called Seneca Falls, in that very same state, a group of women held the first organized women's rights convention in the country. Two entirely different rooms, two entirely different conversations converging on the exact same painfully obvious point. A grown woman deserved to legally exist as herself. Britain moved on almost the exact same clock, just a couple of decades behind. Parliament passed its own Married Women's Property Act in 1870, then went further with a much stronger version in 1882 that finally let a married woman buy, sell and control property entirely on her own terms, no husband's signature required. It took until the very last years of that century, and in some American states well into the next one for the law, to fully catch up to something widows had already been quietly living out for generations. It is worth pausing on the sheer strangeness of the timeline here. A woman's rights as a married adult were being fought for and legislated one grinding state at a time throughout the back half of that century. Meanwhile, a widow simply by outliving her husband had been quietly enjoying most of those exact same rights the entire time, decades ahead of her still married neighbours, without a single protest march or petition required. Grief, as strange as it feels to say out loud, turned out to be a faster path to legal personhood than reform. Remember Sarah Winchester standing in that half-built mansion, with rolls of drawings under her arm, negotiating with carpenters, managing a fortune-buying land, all without asking a single man's permission. That was not simply personality or wealth at work. That was this exact legal machinery quietly operating underneath her entire story. She was not defying the law of her era. She was for the first time in her adult life finally standing fully inside of it. I think about this a lot, honestly, and I would love to hear where you land on it. A legal system built almost entirely to keep women small and dependent for their whole married lives accidentally created the one guaranteed loophole for total independence, and the price of admission was losing the person you loved. Is that empowerment? Or is it just a very cruel kind of consolation prize? I do not think there is a clean answer, and I am not sure there is supposed to be one. Maybe it is both things sitting uncomfortably in the same room the way grief and relief sometimes do, whether anyone wants to admit that out loud or not. Because here is where the story gets its edge. Not every widow used this newfound legal power to quietly manage a farm or raise her children, or live out her years in respectable comfort. Some of them looked at this rare, hard-won legal freedom and did something almost nobody expected a grieving woman in black to do with it. They walked straight into the most aggressively male institution in the entire country, dressed in the exact same mourning clothes everyone assumed made them powerless and invisible, and they started making money. A staggering era-defining amount of it. One of them would go on to become, by a wide margin, the richest woman in the country, feared and mocked in the same breath by men who could not decide whether to underestimate her or simply get out of her way. And that story, I promise you, is even stranger than a house with staircases leading nowhere. In a cramped corner of a bank on Wall Street, behind a wall of steamer trunks stuffed with mortgages, deeds, and railroad bonds, sat a woman eating a bowl of dry oatmeal she had warmed on top of a radiator. Her dress was black plain and worn thin at the seams, the kind of dress you would expect on a struggling widow scraping by not on one of the wealthiest people in the entire country. She refused to pay rent for an office of her own, so she'd simply set up shop inside someone else's, surrounded by paperwork worth more money than most of the men walking past her would see in 10 lifetimes. Those same men, some of them the most powerful financiers in the country, were more than a little afraid of interrupting her lunch. Her name was Hetty Green, and by the time she died, newspapers were calling her the richest woman in America. Not the richest widow, not the richest woman in a particular industry, the richest woman full stop, standing shoulder to shoulder in wealth with men whose names ended up on universities and hospitals, and she built almost all of it herself on Wall Street, wearing the exact same black mourning clothes that were supposed to make a widow invisible. Let's go back to where this all started, because her childhood alone tells you everything about how strangely this woman's brain was wired from the very beginning. She was born in 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, into a wealthy Quaker family that had built its fortune the old-fashioned New England way, whaling ships and shipping routes. Her mother was often too ill to care for her, so her father and grandfather more or less raised her themselves, and instead of bedtime stories they handed a small girl the daily financial newspapers and had her read the shipping and stock reports aloud to her father, whose eyesight was failing. Most children her age were memorizing nursery rhymes. Hetty was memorizing which whaling stocks were rising and which ones were about to sink along with the ships that funded them. I like to imagine what her version of a lullaby must have sounded like. Hush now, the interest compounds quarterly. By the time she was 13 years old, she was already keeping the books for the family business, and by most accounts she was better at it than the grown men she was learning from. At 20, her father, hoping to see her married off, bought her an entire wardrobe of the finest, most fashionable dresses money could buy, the sort of outfits designed specifically to attract a wealthy suitor at a dance. Hetty had other plans for that closet. She quietly sold every single dress and used the money to buy government bonds instead. If you want a single moment that tells you exactly who this woman was going to become for the rest of her life, that is probably it. Offered beauty as currency, she cashed it in for interest payments instead. Her father died in 1865, leaving her a fortune worth several $1 million, an enormous sum for anyone in that era, let alone a young unmarried woman. But the real drama, the part that turned into a genuine courtroom spectacle, came from her aunt. Hetty's aunt, Sylvia Ann Howland, was a wealthy unmarried woman herself, and Hetty had spent years assuming she would inherit a substantial share of her aunt's fortune when the time came. When Sylvia finally died, her will left a large portion of her estate to various charities supporting widows and orphans, an irony that is almost too on the nose given everything else in this story, with the rest placed into a trust that Hetty would only ever receive income from, never the principal itself. Furious, Hetty produced an earlier document, a supposed second page attached to an older version of the will, naming her the sole heir to everything. The case went to court, and it became one of the strangest and most quietly historic trials of the century, because to settle the argument, one side brought in a Harvard mathematician to examine the actual signatures on the paper. What he found was remarkable. Using probability calculations, he demonstrated that Sylvia's signature on Hetty's version of the document matched another known signature of hers with a level of precision that was, statistically speaking, essentially impossible to achieve naturally. Human handwriting always contains small, invisible variations every single time a person signs their name. The tiny tremors and pressure shifts nobody can consciously control. This signature had none. It appeared to have been traced. It was one of the earliest documented uses of mathematical statistical evidence in an American courtroom decades before anyone had coined the phrase forensic science, and Hetty lost the case. She never publicly admitted any wrongdoing, and to be fair to her, the accusation was never fully legally proven beyond that expert opinion either. But the money was gone along with a good portion of her public reputation, and by most accounts, she carried the bitterness of that courtroom loss for the rest of her life. It is a strange footnote to sit with, honestly. A woman who would go on to outcalculate half of Wall Street may have gotten her very first hard lesson in numbers from losing spectacularly to one. Not long after, quite possibly to protect herself from being seen as an easy target for fortune hunters, Hetty married a wealthy merchant named Edward Henry Green, a man who had spent 2 decades building his own fortune-trading silk and tea out in the Philippines, but only after making him agree in writing to keep their finances completely separate, which, considering everything you now know about her, should not surprise you even slightly. The couple moved to London for a few years, where Hetty quietly built an investment portfolio so successful that by some accounts her profits in a single year there reached well over $1 million at a time, when that kind of money could have purchased entire city blocks. She gave birth to 2 children while they lived abroad, a son they called Ned, and a daughter named Sylvia, and for a brief stretch, by every appearance, life looked almost ordinary for her. It would not stay that way for long. Then Edward made a mistake that would define the rest of their marriage. He speculated heavily on Wall Street using her name and credit alongside his own, and lost badly. When the bank holding her assets discovered the scale of his debt, they refused to release millions of dollars in stocks and bonds that legally belonged to her until his obligations were settled. Hetty paid it off to protect her fortune. She never forgave him for it. Years later, when his own spending habits and mounting bills became too much for her to tolerate any further, she packed up their 2 children and simply left, choosing a life in modest apartments across Brooklyn and Hoboken over a marriage she no longer trusted. Now here is where her actual investing genius comes into focus, and I think it deserves far more credit than history has generally given it. Hetty openly said she believed Wall Street, in the speculative gambling sense most people picture, was no fit place for a woman, and honestly no fit place for anyone with good sense. So she simply refused to play that particular game. No buying on margin ever, no chasing hot industrial stocks on a rumour no matter how many men around her swore a certain railroad or a certain mine was about to make everyone rich overnight. She built her fortune instead on real estate, government bonds and mortgage lending, buying property and debt cheap when panic made everyone else desperate to sell, then holding patiently until the market came back around and demand returned. She would sit on a piece of land or a bundle of mortgages for years if that is what the numbers demanded, entirely unbothered by other people's impatience. It is essentially the exact same value investing philosophy that a certain very famous modern billionaire investor would later become worshipped for practicing generations after her. She was doing it first in a floor-length black dress decades before anyone thought to write a book about it, let alone put her picture on the cover. And about that dress. After Edward's death in 1902, Hetty settled fully into mourning black, and given that she was already famously frugal, wearing the same worn garments for years at a stretch, rather than replacing them, that permanent black mourning look became inseparable from her public image. This is where that nickname, the Witch of Wall Street, actually comes from. Not from cruelty or cunning, at least not directly. From a black dress exactly the kind we've already talked about tonight, the uniform an entire society had originally designed to make a grieving woman fade quietly into the background. Hetty did the opposite with it. She took that same camouflage and turned it into a brand. Instead of disappearing into it, she became unmistakable inside it, one of the most recognizable, most feared black silhouettes in American finance. Reporters described her from across a crowded bank lobby without needing to ask her name twice. Funny how the exact same costume can make one woman invisible and another woman impossible to forget, depending entirely on what she decides to do while wearing it. Grief gave her the disguise. She is the one who decided to turn it into a uniform of intimidation instead. Her frugality, by the way, became the stuff of genuine legend around the city. She moved apartments constantly across state lines, specifically to avoid establishing a permanent residency that tax collectors could pin down. She was known to walk several blocks out of her way hunting for broken cookies sold at a discount. One story making the rounds at the time claimed she once spent the better part of an afternoon searching Lower Manhattan for a lost 2-cent stamp, rather than simply buy another. She reportedly delayed her own medical treatment for a painful hernia for years, rather than pay a doctor's fee, eventually resorting to a homemade solution involving nothing more than a stick and sheer stubbornness. Some of the era's more sensational stories about her, including claims that she let her own son's leg injury go untreated purely to save money, are almost certainly exaggerated well past what actually happened, the kind of tale that grows a little more dramatic every time a newspaper reprints it. But even stripped of exaggeration, there is no getting around the fact that her relationship with money bordered on obsession, and it came at a real cost to the people closest to her, not just to her own comfort. It is worth holding both of those truths at once, because flattening her into either a cartoon villain or a feminist saint does her actual complicated life a disservice. Where all of that discipline paid off in a way that is hard to argue with was in 1907, during one of the worst financial panics in the country's history. Banks were failing one after another. Depositors were lining up around city blocks trying to pull their savings out before their bank collapsed entirely, and the whole city of New York needed emergency cash simply to keep functioning. And the person several major banks and even the city government itself turned to for a rescue loan was a woman in a threadbare black dress working out of a borrowed corner office. She wrote a check for over $1 million on the spot to help stabilize the city, one of several occasions across her lifetime when New York effectively went hat in hand to the Witch of Wall Street, asking the woman half of them had spent decades mocking to please quietly save them. She died in 1916, leaving behind a fortune estimated at somewhere around $100 million, at the time a number that would translate into billions today, comfortably placing her among the wealthiest people alive in that era, male or female. The Guinness Book of Records would later somewhat unkindly crown her the greatest miser in recorded history, a title that has followed her name around ever since printed under her photograph in nearly every retelling of her life like a permanent asterisk. I would argue that title misses the point of her entirely. She was not simply cheap. She was disciplined to an almost inhuman degree in a financial world, built and guarded exclusively by men who assumed a woman could not possibly outthink them at their own game. She proved decade after decade patiently and in plain black cotton that she absolutely could, and modern financial historians have quietly started giving her credit for it decades late. The way history often gets around to correcting itself only once nobody involved is left alive to enjoy the apology. Here's what I keep coming back to with her story, and I would honestly love your take on this one. Widowhood gave her the legal freedom to act, but it was her own mind sharpened since childhood that turned that freedom into an empire. Which makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other women of that era had exactly that same sharpness sitting quietly inside them, their entire lives doing the household accounts, reading the newspaper their husbands set aside, just waiting for a legal door that never happened to open for them the way it opened for her. Hetty got her door because a man died. Somewhere out there in a life that never got written down anywhere, there was almost certainly a woman just as sharp as Hetty Green who never got hers at all. Not every widow chose Wall Street, though. Some of them inherited an entirely different kind of empire, built not out of bonds and mortgages, but out of ink printing presses, and a newspaper masthead carrying a name that was never legally hers to begin with, until she simply decided it was. Here's a story about a woman who, in order to save her own life's work, did something almost nobody in the country had ever formally done before. She walked into a courtroom and asked a judge for permission to legally stop being herself and to become, in the eyes of the law, her own dead husband instead. I know how strange that sounds. Stick with me, because by the end of this one I think you'll agree it might be the boldest move any widow in this entire story pulls off. Her name before all of this began was Miriam Florence Follin, born in 1836 in New Orleans, under circumstances that were by most honest accounts a little murky even at the time. Her father was a clever, restless gambler who never quite provided the stable life he liked to imply he had given her. By her teenage years, the family's fortunes had collapsed hard enough that young Miriam found herself scraping by in New York City tenements, rather than the aristocratic parlours she would later claim rather generously to have grown up in. She reinvented her own backstory more than once before she ever touched a printing press, telling people at various points that she was practically a baroness born into old Southern wealth during the war. None of it was true. All of it was in its own strange way training for what came next, because this was a woman who understood something most people never quite grasp about identity. It is not always a fixed fact. Sometimes it is simply the story you have the nerve to keep telling until everyone else agrees to believe it. She tried her hand at the stage for a while too, under a handful of different names, none of them entirely her own, moving through a rough patch of young adulthood that her later biographers have described delicately as colourful, and that she herself was careful never to discuss in much detail once she had money and a household name to protect. I bring this up not to judge her for it, but because I think it matters for what comes later. This was a woman who had already spent years learning exactly how much of a person's identity is simply a performance other people agree to accept long before she ever had a legal reason to test that idea in a courtroom. She married young and badly the first time, a brief teenage marriage to a jeweler's clerk that barely survived long enough to be worth mentioning. Then again to a writer, archaeologist and diplomat named Ephraim George Squire, a marriage that eventually fell apart amid a rather public scandal involving a wealthy magazine publisher named Frank Leslie. Leslie had built an enormous illustrated newspaper empire, one of the biggest publishing houses in the country at the time, filled with titles covering everything from current events to fashion to popular fiction, with names like Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper and Frank Leslie's Ladies Magazine, reaching households across the country every single week. Once her second marriage ended in divorce, a fairly scandalous thing for a woman to do openly. At the time, Miriam married Frank Leslie and quickly proved she was not simply along for the ride. She became an editor herself, shaping the content of his magazines aimed at women readers, and by most accounts she had a sharper instinct for what the public actually wanted to read than half the men drawing a salary in that building. Then, in January of 1880, Frank Leslie died of cancer, and Miriam inherited what looked on paper like an absolute catastrophe rather than an empire. The publishing house was drowning in debt, reportedly more than $300,000 of it, at a time when the entire nation was still recovering from a brutal economic depression that had already crushed the circulation numbers of most weekly magazines. To make matters even messier, Leslie's own adult sons from an earlier marriage were locked in an ugly legal fight with the company over who actually had the right to use the family name on their own competing publications, meaning Miriam was not simply fighting creditors, she was fighting her own stepsons for the right to keep the family business functioning at all. Miriam, now a 44-year-old widow with a household name attached to her, and almost no cash left to run it, made herself a promise. She told the people closest to her that she intended to take up the work herself and restore her late husband's reputation debts, and all a promise that must have sounded to anyone watching from the outside almost delusional. It got worse before it got better. For a stretch of time, this woman, who had once lived in some of Manhattan's most luxurious hotels, found herself renting a bare attic room. No wallpaper, no working fireplace, a window set so high in the wall she had to stand on a chair just to see daylight. Picture that contrast for a second. A household name in American publishing sleeping in a room that cold simply to keep the lights on downstairs at the printing house, while she fought off creditors one lawsuit at a time. Here's a detail I have to point out because it reminds you how often women in this exact position ended up quietly rescuing each other. Miriam was still deeply in debt when a wealthy widow named Eliza Jane Smith, who had been following the court battles in the newspapers and admired her sheer stubbornness, showed up and handed her a check for $50,000, taking Miriam's own diamonds as collateral against the loan. One widow essentially betting on another widow's nerve at a moment when no bank in the city would have taken that same bet. Miriam paid every cent of it back on schedule and used the breathing room to keep fighting. And fight she did, eventually winning the lawsuits against Leslie's sons and settling the company's debts. But she wanted something more permanent than a legal victory. She wanted absolute unquestioned ownership over the name printed across every masthead in that building, and here is where her story takes its strangest turn. In a special session of court, Miriam Florence Folin Leslie legally changed her name, not to something new, to Frank Leslie. Her own husband's full name, first and last, became her actual legal identity for the remainder of her life. Not a nickname. Not a courtesy title borrowed the way any widow might be casually called by her late husband's name in polite conversation. An honest-to-goodness legal name change filed with the court so that from that day forward, when a contract needed the signature of Frank Leslie, owner and publisher, she could sign it herself and mean it completely within the law. Think about what that decision actually is for a second, because I think it deserves more credit than it usually gets. We spent an earlier part of tonight talking about how a married woman's whole legal identity used to dissolve into her husband's. The moment she said her vows, how the law used to treat husband and wife as one single legal person, and that person was by definition him. Miriam had already lived through that exact erasure once during her marriage. Then, as a widow, standing on the other side of it with full legal personhood finally restored to her, she made an audacious, almost mischievous choice. She walked right back into that same erasure completely voluntarily, on her own terms for her own reasons, and used it as a weapon instead of a cage. The very same legal fusion that used to swallow a wife whole she now wielded, deliberately turning herself into an unkillable brand that no rival publisher, no disgruntled stepson, and no skeptical creditor could ever legally challenge again. If the law once said a woman disappears into her husband's name, she looked at that old unfair rule and decided, fine, then I will simply become the most famous version of that name the country has ever seen. There is something almost defiant hidden inside that legal filing if you sit with it long enough. Coverture had spent centuries treating a wife's absorbed identity as a kind of quiet tragedy, a woman folded invisibly into a man's legal shadow. Miriam took that exact same mechanism, and for what might be the only documented time in the whole story we're telling tonight, chose it deliberately with her eyes wide open, purely because it happened to be the single most useful legal tool available to protect everything she had personally rebuilt from nothing. It is coverture essentially performed in reverse by choice, by a woman standing entirely on her own 2 feet. It worked spectacularly well. Under her direction, the publishing house's circulation grew from around 30,000 readers to somewhere near 200,000 within just a couple of years. She had sharp editorial instincts and an even sharper sense for a breaking story. When President James Garfield was shot in the summer of 1881, she had illustrators on a train to Washington, almost before most of her competitors had finished reading the telegram. Newspapers of the era started calling her the Empress of Journalism, and a few, only half-joking, referred to her as a commercial Joan of Arc, a woman who had marched into a battlefield everyone assumed would destroy her, and come out the other side running the whole operation. Within a year, by most accounts, the business that had nearly bankrupted her was turning an annual profit somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000, an almost unthinkable turnaround for a company that had been circling bankruptcy court barely 2 years earlier. She leaned fully into the persona to arriving at her own offices each morning in silk and cashmere diamonds, catching the light, looking by most descriptions younger and sharper than her years, turning herself quite deliberately into the story, alongside the stories she published. There is something almost cinematic about picturing her walking those hallways, a woman who had once slept under a leaking attic roof, now presiding over a media empire, wearing enough jewellery to make a Wall Street financier nervous, though I imagine Hetty Green, whom we just spent quite a while with, would have found the whole diamond wardrobe thing spectacularly wasteful. Here's the twist in her story that I think earns her a permanent place in this conversation, though, and it has almost nothing to do with publishing at all. She sold her remaining publishing interests around 1902, and married once more along the way a short and fairly troubled union to William Wilde, the younger brother of the writer Oscar Wilde, which did not last long and did not slow her down much either. When Miriam died in 1914, she left behind an estate worth close to $2 million, and in her will, rather than leaving that fortune to family or to charity in any conventional sense, she left the bulk of it to a woman named Carrie Chapman Catt, one of the leading figures fighting for women's right to vote in America, with clear written instructions that the money should go directly toward advancing that cause. The gift was so unexpected that outraged relatives and old friends of the Leslie family spent nearly 2 years contesting the will in court, apparently unable to accept that the woman known for decades primarily as a wealthy publisher's flamboyant widow had quietly been one of the movement's most significant financial backers all along. Catt eventually won that fight, and the money helped fund a suffrage newspaper that kept publishing right up until the year American women finally secured the right to vote, and for years afterward under a different name entirely. Sit with that ending for a second, because I do not think it is an accident, and I would love to know if you read it the same way I do. A woman spends decades building her power under a name that was never originally hers, a name she borrowed, transformed, and ultimately conquered on her own terms. Then at the very end, she quietly redirects everything that name had earned her toward making sure the next generation of women would never need to borrow anyone's name or anyone's legal identity to be taken seriously at all. She used the old unfair system perfectly, then spent her fortune trying to dismantle it for everyone who came after her. I keep asking myself which part of her story is actually the braver one. Was it walking into that courtroom and legally becoming Frank Leslie to save the business, gambling her own name on a dead man's reputation? Or was it the quiet decision made decades later to hand nearly everything that name had built toward tearing the whole unfair arrangement down for good, for women she would never live long enough to meet? I honestly think both moments belong to the same woman, making the same calculation just at different stages of her life. Take power however the rules of your era will actually let you take it. Then once you have enough of it, spend it rewriting the rules for whoever comes next. Not every widow in this story chose to build something that would outlive her, though. Some of them looked at that exact same freedom and used it to build a legend instead, one so carefully constructed and so relentlessly defended for decades afterward that most people today cannot separate the real man from the myth his widow spent the rest of her life polishing. On the 6th of July, 1876, a soldier knocked on a farmhouse door out in Dakota Territory, and the young woman who opened it already knew, before he said a single word, that her entire life had just ended. She had spent the previous days sensing that something was wrong, the kind of quiet, gnawing dread that army wives on frontier posts learn to live with and rarely learn to voice out loud. When the officer finally stood in front of her grim-faced holding a telegram, she did not need him to finish his sentence. Her name was Elizabeth Bacon Custer. Everyone close to her called her Libby, and the man standing on her porch that morning was there to tell her that her husband, along with his entire immediate command, had been wiped out 2 weeks earlier at a river called the Little Bighorn. Here is the part of this story that almost never gets told, and I think it should be the very first thing you picture. Libby was the first widow at that fort to receive the news, and once she had absorbed it herself, she did not collapse. She got up, and she walked from house to house across that same army post, personally telling the other officers' wives that they too had just become widows that morning. 5 members of her own extended family died in that single afternoon on the battlefield, her husband among them, along with 2 of his brothers, a brother-in-law and a nephew. An entire family gone by nightfall, and the 34-year-old woman left standing in the middle of it was expected by every social rule of her era to grieve quietly, gracefully, and then fade politely into the background for the rest of her natural life. She did not do that. Instead, she spent the next 57 years, more than half a century, waging one of the most successful public relations campaigns in American history, and the product she was selling was her husband's name. Let's back up for a second, because you need to understand who Libby actually was before any of this happened, since it explains so much about what came next. She grew up in Monroe, Michigan, the daughter of a respected judge educated at one of the finest schools available to a young woman at the time, and by most accounts sharp enough that she graduated at the very top of her class. She had ambitions of her own before she ever met George Armstrong Custer, reportedly hoping to study art in New York. Instead, she met a dashing young cavalry officer during the war, married him, and spent the following 12 years as an army wife, following him from one remote frontier posting to another, hosting officers, managing households on the edge of nowhere, and by every account thriving in a role that most women of her polished, genteel upbringing would have found unbearable. She learned to ride to endure brutal winters in canvas tents, to host a formal dinner one week, and pack up an entire household onto a wagon the next. Whatever else you want to say about her later choices, she was clearly not a fragile woman playing dress-up as a frontier wife. She was the genuine article. Then came the Little Bighorn, and everything about her comfortable if unconventional life collapsed overnight. George Custer, it turned out, had also left behind a mountain of gambling debts. So Libby was not simply grieving. She was grieving while broke in an era when a widow of her social standing was expected to survive quietly on whatever pension or family charity happened to be available to her, and absolutely was not expected to go out and earn her own living in any public visible way. She chose the second option anyway, and this is where her story becomes something remarkably unusual among everyone we have talked about tonight so far. She did not build a company. She did not conquer Wall Street or a printing press. She picked up a pen instead, and she started writing. Over the following years, Libby published 3 full-length books about her life with George on the frontier, filled with vivid, carefully composed stories about their marriage, his leadership, and the hardships of army life out west. Books with titles like Boots and Saddles and Tenting on the Plains, written in a warm, personal voice that made readers across the country feel as though they had personally known the man. She followed those books with a national lecture circuit, standing in front of packed halls, describing her husband as a devoted family man and a brilliant, misunderstood military commander who'd been failed in her telling not by his own decisions on the battlefield, but by subordinate officers who did not move quickly enough to support him when it mattered most. That particular claim, by the way, about which officers deserved blame for what happened at the Little Bighorn, is still argued over by historians to this day more than a century later, and Libby's version of events, delivered with enormous personal conviction from stages across the country, for decades played no small part in shaping which version most Americans grew up believing. Here's the detail that stops me every time I think about it. Public criticism of George Armstrong Custer, and there was actually quite a lot of it circulating in private and in early newspaper coverage right after the battle, essentially went quiet for decades, while Libby was alive and actively working the lecture circuit. Historians who might otherwise have written a more complicated, more critical account of his military record largely held their tongues, not necessarily because they had changed their minds, but because publicly attacking the devoted grieving widow of a fallen soldier was considered at minimum extraordinarily poor form. It is a strange kind of power when you think about it, one that never needed a courtroom, a bank account, or a printing press to enforce itself. It only needed everybody else's sense of decency and their reluctance to be the person who publicly humiliated a widow, still wearing black decades after the funeral. Do you see what that means? When you sit with it for a second, an entire nation's historical memory of a major military disaster was for more than 50 years quietly held hostage by simple good manners toward one determined widow. That is not something money can buy. That is something only grief performed convincingly and relentlessly enough over enough years can accomplish. I want to be fair to her here, because I do not think this makes Libby a villain or even particularly calculating in some cold, cynical sense. I think it is entirely possible, likely even, that she loved her husband deeply and sincerely believed every word she wrote and said about him for the rest of her life. Grief and strategy are not opposites. Sometimes the most effective strategy anyone ever builds grows directly out of grief that refuses to let go. She needed the income her books and lectures provided absolutely, since her husband's debts had left her with very little else, and a widow of her social standing writing for money was in itself a small act of quiet rebellion against what polite society expected of her. But she also seems to have needed on some deeply personal level for the world to remember George Custer exactly the way she remembered him, brave and devoted and wronged, rather than the way his harshest critics were already starting to describe him, even before she finished unpacking her mourning clothes. Both of those things, the financial necessity and the fierce personal loyalty, appear to have pulled in the exact same direction for almost her entire adult life, which made her one of the most effective advocates any historical reputation has ever had. It is worth remembering too that Libby was not fighting this battle in a vacuum. Powerful people in Washington, including voices close to President Grant's own administration, had already started quietly suggesting that Custer's own reckless ambition, his hunger for a decisive headline-making victory, was what led an entire column of soldiers to their deaths that afternoon. That was the story with real momentum in the months right after the battle. A proud, glory-hungry officer who got hundreds of men killed chasing his own reputation, Libby effectively spent the rest of her life standing directly in front of that narrative, refusing to let it settle into the history books uncontested, and for the better part of 6 decades it largely did not, which raises a question I would love to hear your honest answer to. If you lost someone you loved and the entire world was actively deciding in real time whether to remember them as a hero or a disaster, would you stay quiet out of dignity, or would you spend the rest of your life fighting to control that story yourself? I am not sure there is a wrong answer here. I just do not think most of us ever get tested on it, quite this publicly, or for quite this long, with an entire country watching to see which version we manage to make stick. Libby Custer lived to be almost 91 years old, dying in 1933, having outlived her husband by 57 years, nearly 5 times longer than their actual marriage had lasted. She never remarried, which itself became part of the legend, the eternally devoted widow who gave the rest of her life to one man's memory. In her final years, she was still working, trying to convince Congress to fund an actual museum near the Little Bighorn battlefield itself, still tending the legend right up until she physically could not anymore, drafting letters and giving interviews well into old age with the same careful, deliberate discipline she had brought to the project since she was 34 years old. And here is the detail that for me seals the whole story. Barely a year after she finally passed away, a book came out titled Glory Hunter, offering the first truly critical, unflinching reassessment of George Custer's military career and personal ambition in decades. 1 year, that is how long it took for the historical conversation to shift once the one woman guarding the gate around her husband's reputation was no longer alive to guard it. By then, of course, an enormous amount of the raw, unfiltered evidence and eyewitness testimony from the years right after the battle had already faded, been lost, or simply died along with the people who remembered it firsthand, meaning the record historians eventually worked with was already shaped in ways both obvious and invisible by the 6 decades Libby had spent curating it. I keep coming back to how strange and specific her particular brand of power actually was compared to everyone else we've discussed tonight. She did not inherit legal rights over property exactly the way we talked about earlier, though of course she held those too as a widow, same as any of them. What Libby Custer actually claimed for herself and defended for nearly 6 decades with total unwavering discipline was something far less tangible and in its own way far more powerful. Custody over memory itself, ownership essentially of how an entire country would remember one specific man, and by extension one specific and highly consequential afternoon in American history. Money runs out eventually or gets divided up among heirs. Companies get sold or fold entirely. A well-built, relentlessly defended legend, it turns out, can comfortably outlive its author by more than half a century before anyone finally works up the nerve to question it out loud. And even then, pieces of her version of the story still linger stubbornly in the popular imagination today more than 100 years later. Grief given a pen and a lecture stage is an entirely different kind of weapon than grief given a bank account or a printing press, and I think it deserves to be recognised as exactly that. Not every widow we're talking about tonight built something you could touch or spend. Some of them built something you simply believed without ever quite realising somebody had spent an entire lifetime constructing it for you. One carefully chosen sentence, one packed lecture hall, one respectfully silent critic at a time. If Hetty Green weaponized a black dress, and if Miriam Leslie weaponized a legal signature, then Libby Custer weaponized something even less regulated than either of those. Public sympathy itself. Nobody needed a court's permission to feel sorry for a devoted widow, and nobody, it turned out, had ever quite figured out how to legislate against one who used that sympathy this skillfully for this long. Not every widow used that same borrowed freedom to protect somebody else's name, though. Some of them turned around and used it to feed an appetite far colder and far more calculating than grief ever was, and that particular story, I have to warn you now, gets considerably darker than anything we've covered so far tonight. She was not rich. She had no stocks, no printing press, no lecture circuit filling out her calendar. What this next woman had instead was patience and an unsettling talent for knowing exactly how a nursing bill and a life insurance payout could add up to the very same number. Her name was Sarah Jane Robinson, and by the time Boston newspapers finished writing about her, they'd given her a nickname borrowed straight from Renaissance Italy. The Boston Borgia, after the infamous Italian family, whose name had become shorthand fairly or not for poison used as a tool of ambition. It is a dramatic label, and I want to be honest with you up front that what actually happened in her modest Cambridge boarding house was far less glamorous and considerably more devastating than any Italian palace intrigue. Sarah was born in Ireland in 1838 and emigrated to Massachusetts as a young teenager, with her sister working first as a domestic servant before marrying a machinist named Moses Robinson. They had 8 children together, though only 5 survived past infancy, which alone tells you something painful about the odds an ordinary working-class family was up against in that era, long before any of the poisoning ever began. Money was tight, then tighter, then desperately thin. The family moved constantly, always a step ahead of unpaid rent, always looking for the next small opening that might keep them afloat, the kind of grinding, unglamorous poverty that never makes it into paintings or novels about the Gilded Age because it was never meant to be looked at directly by the people enjoying the era's golden marble. One of those openings came through something called the United Order of Pilgrim Fathers, a mutual aid society that offered cheap life insurance policies to working-class men and women who could never have afforded a policy from one of the larger, more established insurance companies. This detail matters enormously to the rest of the story, so hold on to it. This organization existed specifically to protect families like Sarah's, to make sure that if a breadwinner died, the people left behind would not be thrown immediately into starvation. Life insurance, remember, was still a fairly new concept for ordinary working people at this point in history, spreading rapidly precisely because so many families had watched a single death collapse an entire household's finances overnight. It was in its own modest way meant to be a small mercy, built directly into a system that otherwise offered working families almost none. Sarah Robinson looked at that same small mercy and saw something else entirely, an opportunity. Between 1881 and 1886 in the Cambridge area, a remarkable and remarkably suspicious number of people connected to Sarah Robinson fell fatally ill. Her elderly landlord passed away first in the summer of 1881. Then her own husband Moses the following year in an episode initially blamed on nothing more sinister than drinking cold water while overheated. Then one of her young daughters, only 10 years old. then her sister, then her brother-in-law, whose young son she quietly adopted immediately afterward, along with control of the insurance policy, meant to support the boy's care, a policy worth roughly $2,000, a considerable sum for a family in her position. Then that same young nephew. Then another of her own daughters, 24 years old. Then finally, in the summer of 1886, her own son fell gravely ill, in an illness that looked disturbingly similar to all the others that had come before it. Read that list back slowly for a second. A landlord, a husband, 2 daughters, a sister, a brother-in-law, a nephew barely old enough for school. Almost everyone this woman was supposed to love, or at minimum supposed to house and depend upon, dying in a slow, steady procession across exactly 5 years. I am going to be careful with the details here because there is a version of this story that leans hard into the grisly specifics, and I do not think that version actually serves you, or the memory of the people who died. What matters is the pattern, not the particulars. Nearly every person on that list, with one notable exception, held a life insurance policy through that same mutual aid society, and Sarah Robinson was the one who collected or attempted to collect on almost every single payout. She was also, by multiple accounts from people who knew her, the one who nursed each of them personally through their final illness, sending for a different doctor nearly every time, so that no single physician ever saw the full damning pattern stretched out across 5 years. There is one detail that unsettles me more than almost anything else in tonight's story, and I want to share it carefully. According to accounts from the time, Sarah would sometimes mention to friends or neighbours an unsettling premonition, a dream that a particular family member was not long for this world. These premonitions had an uncanny habit of coming true almost exactly once she'd confirmed that person's insurance was fully paid up and in order. It was her own son's sudden severe illness that finally brought the pattern into the light. A doctor treating him grew suspicious enough of the symptoms, having likely heard whispers around the neighbourhood about the family's unusually bad luck, to send a sample for chemical analysis, and a Harvard chemist confirmed the presence of arsenic. Once that single result came back, investigators went back and exhumed several of the earlier bodies, digging up graves that everyone involved had assumed were closed for good. Every single one they tested came back the same way. Sarah Robinson was tried twice. The first trial for the death of her son ended in a hung jury after the panel spent a full day arguing and simply could not reach a unified verdict, in part because the prosecution had been legally barred from mentioning any of the other suspicious deaths during that particular trial. Prosecutors, apparently frustrated by how the case had been handled, the first time brought a second case this time for the death of her brother-in-law, and this time armed with a clearer path to present the pattern of arsenic poisoning across the family. The jury convicted her. She was sentenced to death by hanging. 2 men who had been close to her during those years, a chaplain from the very same mutual aid society who had reportedly been calling on her often, and a doctor who sold patent medicines and had apparently been courting her for some time, were also initially charged as possible accomplices. Prosecutors ultimately dropped those charges before trial, leaving the full legal weight of everything that happened resting on Sarah alone, and in a detail that reads almost like something out of fiction. After she'd already been sent to prison and her old house had been sold, the new owners renovating the property found a box of rat poison hidden inside a hole in the cellar wall, tucked away behind the furnace, where nobody would have thought to look unless they already knew exactly what they were searching for. And here is where her story takes a turn I think deserves real attention, because it connects directly to something we were just talking about only a few minutes ago tonight. In the weeks following her death sentence, public sentiment in Massachusetts began shifting visibly and rapidly in Sarah Robinson's favour. A petition asking the governor to commute her sentence to life in prison instead of execution eventually gathered roughly 500 signatures, including remarkably more than 70 ministers and even several members of the very jury that had just convicted her. Newspaper accounts from the time describe her in court as having an intelligent, almost refined bearing, the kind of description that seemed to make plenty of observers uncomfortable with the idea of actually hanging her, regardless of what the evidence had shown. The governor granted the request. Sarah Robinson would spend the rest of her life in prison rather than facing the gallows, and she died there in 1906, roughly 2 decades after her arrest, of complications from a long illness. Sit with that for a second, because I think it is one of the most quietly disturbing details in this entire story. A courtroom had just proven to the satisfaction of a jury that this woman poisoned members of her own family for money, and a meaningful portion of the public still could not bring itself to see her executed, because underneath the horror of what she had done, she was still visually and socially a grieving widow and mother. The exact same category of woman society had spent this whole story instinctively protecting, forgiving, and looking away from. We talked earlier about how public sympathy for a devoted widow could quietly shape an entire nation's memory of a military disaster for 50 years. Here, that same reflexive sympathy very nearly spared a convicted killer from the consequences everyone agreed on paper that she deserved. The same social instinct kindness toward a suffering woman cuts in wildly different directions depending entirely on what that particular woman actually did with the sympathy she was handed. It is worth pausing too on the people this story is actually about, since it is easy to let a case this strange become entirely about the person who caused it. A 10-year-old girl, a young woman of 24, a 7-year-old boy who had just lost both of his parents and was for a brief window finally safe in what should have been a loving home, an elderly landlord who likely thought he was simply being cared for in his final illness by a kind neighbour. None of them left behind books or fortunes or lecture tours. They left behind almost nothing at all except a pattern in old court records that took investigators 5 years and one final, nearly fatal illness to finally notice. I think there's an uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, and I would honestly like to know how you land on it. Every widow we have talked about tonight found a door that grief and circumstance had accidentally left open for her and walked through it. Sarah Winchester built a mansion nobody could tell her to stop building. Hetty Green built a fortune nobody thought a woman could manage. Libby Custer built a legend that outlasted the truth by decades. Sarah Jane Robinson found a door too. It just happened to be attached to an insurance office instead of a bank or a printing press, and behind it was nothing but grief manufactured on purpose for profit, at the cost of the very people she should have protected. Freedom, it turns out, does not come with a built-in moral compass. It is simply an open door. What anyone does once they are standing on the other side of it says everything about the person and almost nothing about the door itself. I think that is worth remembering every single time we are tempted to romanticize this era's grieving women as uniformly brave or uniformly wronged. Some of them were. This one very clearly was not. There's a broader pattern hiding underneath her individual story too, one worth naming honestly before we move on. The rapid growth of affordable life insurance in this era, the same industry that gave so many working-class widows a genuine lifeline after losing a husband, also created, almost as an unavoidable side effect, a small window of financial temptation for people desperate enough or cold-blooded enough to exploit it. Sarah Robinson was not the only person of her era eventually caught doing exactly this, and she would not be the last. She was simply one of the most thoroughly documented, largely because her case relied on some of the earlier serious forensic toxicology work used in an American courtroom. The same slow-grinding machinery of chemistry and investigation that would go on to solve countless legitimate cases of foul play got a significant portion of its early practice uncomfortably enough catching women just like her one exhumed coffin at a time. It is a strange backhanded kind of legacy. The insurance industry that widows truly needed to survive also unintentionally funded the birth of the forensic science that eventually caught the small handful of people willing to abuse it. Not everyone chasing money through death during this era needed poison at all, though, or even needed to wait for someone else to die first. Some of the strangest business built around Gilded Age grief did not come from widows themselves, but from the people who made a very comfortable living convincing those same widows that their dead husbands were still trying quite desperately to speak to them. Picture a darkened parlour somewhere in New England, curtains drawn tight, even at midday a round table in the centre of the room, and a circle of hands joined together in the dim candlelight. Someone asks a question out loud into the silence addressed to nobody visibly present in the room. And then from somewhere inside the walls or the floorboards or perhaps the table itself comes a soft, unmistakable knock. That single knock multiplied across thousands of parlours, church halls and private homes for the better part of a century became one of the strangest, most profitable industries to ever grow directly out of widowhood. Not clothing this time, not law or money or memory. This industry sold something far more tempting than any of those. It sold the promise that the person you lost was not actually gone at all. The whole movement can be traced back to a single farmhouse in upstate New York in 1848, where two young sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, convinced their family, and soon their entire community, that they could communicate with the spirit of a murdered peddler through a series of mysterious rapping sounds echoing through their small home at night. Word spread fast the way it tends to when a story promises something people desperately want to be true. Within a few short years, those two teenagers had toured the country-packed lecture halls with paying audiences and single-handedly launched a movement that would eventually claim millions of believers across America and Europe, all built on the simple, irresistible premise that the dead were still listening, and under the right conditions still willing to talk back. It is worth noting how perfectly the timing lined up too. This movement caught fire in the decades leading directly into and then straight through a civil war that would leave hundreds of thousands of American families suddenly violently bereaved, followed by an entire Gilded Age still soaked in the mourning customs we've already spent time on tonight. Spiritualism did not arrive by accident. It arrived exactly when an entire country was desperate enough to need it. You can probably already guess who made up a significant share of that eager paying audience: grieving widows, and it is not hard to understand why. We've spent this entire story talking about a black dress and a legal system that forced these women into long stretches of enforced silence and separation from ordinary life. Now imagine you're sitting inside that isolation, likely for the first time in your marriage, completely alone with your own grief, months into a mourning period nobody else was allowed to interrupt with an invitation or a distraction, when someone offers you the chance to simply speak to your husband one more time. Ask him where he kept the deed to the property. Ask him if he's proud of how you have managed without him. Ask him simply if he still loves you. For the price of admission to a séance, that conversation was apparently entirely possible, and given how thoroughly this culture had already trained widows to sit quietly with unspoken grief, is it really any wonder so many of them walked through that parlour door? Of course, a great deal of it was theatre, and often fairly clumsy theatre at that once you know what to look for. Mediums built entire toolkits around convincing a grieving, hopeful audience that something supernatural was occurring in the room. Objects would appear to float, usually thanks to a length of thread or a hidden rod nobody thought to check for in a darkened room. Photographs would come back from the developer with a hazy, ghostly figure standing just behind the grieving widow in her portrait, produced through simple, well-understood darkroom trickery that most customers had no reason to suspect. Some of the more elaborate operations even used a second person, hidden behind a curtain or under the table, feeding the medium information gathered earlier through casual conversation, information the client had quite innocently already shared herself over tea before the séance even began. And more than a few mediums of the era found it remarkably convenient that their preferred spirit guide happened to be some distant, exotic, thoroughly unverifiable figure from centuries past, an ancient sage or a long-dead foreign princess, someone who could speak in vague, comforting generalities without ever being caught contradicting a single detail. A skeptical relative might actually be able to check. Here's the detail that really lands the whole thing for me. In 1888, 4 decades after that first farmhouse rapping session started the entire movement, Margaret Fox herself finally admitted publicly that the sounds had never been supernatural at all. She and her sister had simply learned to crack the joints in their toes and fingers with enough precision to produce a convincing knocking sound whenever they wanted one. An entire spiritual movement, one that had already comforted and financially supported thousands of professional mediums across 2 continents, had been built on a party trick 2 bored teenage sisters invented to scare their mother. And here is the part I find almost more interesting than the confession itself. It barely mattered. Margaret Fox later tried to walk her confession back under circumstances that remain murky even now, and by that point spiritualism as a movement had grown so large, so emotionally load-bearing for so many people, that a single embarrassing confession from one of its 2 founders could not meaningfully slow it down, which tells you something important about grief that I think we should sit with for a second. People did not attend these séances because the evidence was convincing. They attended because the alternative, total permanent silence from someone they loved was simply unbearable to sit with alone. Given the choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comforting performance, an enormous number of people understandably chose the performance, evidence be damned. One of the most famous believers in the whole movement was a woman whose grief by any honest account had truly earned every ounce of comfort she went looking for. Mary Todd Lincoln lost her husband to an assassin's bullet in 1865, but that loss came stacked on top of an already devastating string of earlier ones, including 2 young sons who died in childhood, one of them, Willie, passing away in the White House itself, only a few years before his father was killed there under entirely different circumstances. In the years that followed, she consulted mediums repeatedly, reportedly holding at least 1 séance inside the White House itself, while she was still First Lady, hoping to reach her boys and continuing to seek out mediums for years afterward, as widowhood piled loss upon loss, with almost no pause in between. Her later years grew increasingly difficult, marked by erratic spending and behaviour, severe enough that her own surviving son eventually had her committed to a mental health facility for a time. I want to be careful here because I am not a doctor, and I do not think it is fair or accurate to slap a tidy modern diagnosis onto a woman who lived through that much compounded loss more than a century and a half ago. What we can say honestly is that spiritualism offered her and countless women carrying grief of a similar weight, a place to put that pain, that traditional mourning etiquette with all its rigid rules about veils and calendars simply never provided. Now here's where the story does something I honestly was not expecting when I first went digging into it, and it flips the entire picture we've painted so far. Being a medium was for a surprising number of women one of the only publicly respectable professions available to them that also came with real influence and real income attached. Think about everything we have covered tonight about how narrow the world was for a woman trying to speak, earn, or lead in this era. A woman could not vote. In most places she could not preach from a pulpit. She could rarely lecture publicly on serious subject without being labelled improper or unwomanly. But if she entered a trance first and delivered her message as though a spirit, often a dramatic, exotic-sounding spirit guide, were speaking directly through her audiences, would happily sit and listen to social commentary, political opinions, even early arguments for women's rights coming out of her own mouth the entire time. Historians who study this era have actually traced a real documented overlap between spiritualist trance lecturers and the earliest organisers of the women's suffrage movement. Women who discovered that a spirit guide's borrowed authority could get a political argument heard in rooms that would never have tolerated hearing it delivered plainly in a woman's own name. It is almost impossible to miss the pattern by now. A woman's own voice considered too forward, too improper, too much, when spoken plainly suddenly became perfectly acceptable the moment everyone agreed to pretend it belonged to somebody else. We watched a widow's black dress work as a kind of camouflage earlier tonight. Here an entire trance became the exact same kind of disguise, just constructed out of performance instead of fabric. Not everyone stayed a believer, of course. And one particular skeptic's story deserves mentioning because his motivation for exposing the whole industry came from a wound that should feel painfully familiar by now. The magician Harry Houdini lost his mother in 1913, and by his own account grieved her so deeply that he eventually sat for a séance himself, desperate for one final word from her. What he got instead was a vague, generic message that could have applied to literally anyone's dead mother, delivered by a medium closely associated with his own friend, the author Arthur Conan Doyle, who had become one of spiritualism's most devoted and famous public defenders, a man so convinced of the movement's truth that no amount of evidence to the contrary ever seemed to shake him. Houdini walked away from that experience furious, not comforted, and he spent much of the rest of his career using his own considerable skills as an illusionist to travel the country, exposing fraudulent mediums one by one, sitting in on their séances incognito, and then standing up afterward to demonstrate step by step exactly how each supposed miracle had been faked, using tools any working magician would recognize immediately. His friendship with Doyle, who never stopped believing regardless of how many tricks Houdini exposed, eventually collapsed entirely over the disagreement. Two men who had once respected each other deeply, driven apart by two completely different answers to the exact same unbearable question. Two brilliant men, both devastated by loss in their own ways, arriving at completely opposite conclusions about where comfort was actually allowed to come from. I keep turning this particular chapter over in my head because I do not think it resolves as neatly as some of the others we have covered tonight. Was this industry a cruel one built on lying to desperate grieving women for profit? Clearly, in a great many documented cases, yes. Absolutely. But was it also unintentionally one of the very few stages where a woman could stand in front of a room and be taken seriously simply by convincing everyone that the words were not entirely her own? I think that is also true, and I do not think those two truths cancel each other out. Which would you have found more insulting if you had lived through it? Being lied to about your husband's spirit knocking on a table, or being told plainly that your own actual voice was not allowed to be heard unless you first pretended it belonged to someone else? I honestly go back and forth on that question every time I sit down to think about it, and I would be lying if I told you I had landed on a firm answer. There is one more thread worth pulling here before we move along. because it says something about how differently we treat the exact same emotional need depending on who is meeting it. A widow spending her limited savings on a medium was more often than not treated by her community as pitiable gullible, perhaps a little embarrassing. Meanwhile, an entire respectable industry of formal church, sanctioned mourning rituals, expensive funerals, elaborate memorial jewellery, all of it built on very similar promises of comfort and connection to the dead, was considered perfectly proper, even admirable. Both were in their own ways selling the same basic product. Peace of mind against unbearable loss. Only one of them required a séance table to do it, and only one of them got quietly mocked in the newspapers for the privilege. Not every transaction built around a widow's loss during this era happened in a candlelit parlour with a hired medium whispering behind a curtain, though. Some of the largest, most consequential exchanges of money for grief in the entire era happened in broad daylight, filed as official paperwork stamped and processed by clerks working directly for the government of the United States itself. In December of 2020, newspaper across the country ran an oddly specific headline. The last widow of the American Civil War had died. She was 101 years old, and her name was Helen Viola Jackson. Do the math on that for a second, because it does not add up the way you would expect. The Civil War ended in 1865. Helen Viola Jackson was born in 1919. How exactly does a war that ended more than 50 years before a woman was even born leave her technically, legally, its very last widow? For a moment, just sit in that confusion with me, because I promise the actual answer is even stranger than the question. The answer to that question is going to take us somewhere I honestly did not expect this story to go tonight, into a government program so enormous, so long-lasting and so strange in its final decades that it eventually turned widowhood itself into something people could quite deliberately, quite calculatingly marry their way into. Here's what actually happened with Helen. In 1936, when she was 17 years old, she married a man named James Bolin, who was 93 at the time, a surviving veteran of the Union Army, who had actually served during the Civil War itself 7 decades earlier. It was reportedly not a romantic marriage in any conventional sense. By most accounts, it was an arrangement, a kindness on her part to an elderly, frail neighbour who needed someone to care for him in his final years in exchange for something that mattered enormously to a family living through the depths of the Great Depression. A government pension guaranteed to her as his widow for the rest of her own natural life. The two of them reportedly kept the marriage a secret for decades, worried about how their community and possibly her own family would react to such an unusual arrangement. James Bolin died in 1939, only a few years after the wedding. Helen went on living for another 81 years, and the federal government kept a small check moving in her direction that entire time, technically still paying out benefits connected to a war that had ended nearly a century before most of those payments were ever issued, and Helen was not even the only one. A woman named Gertrude Janeway married an 81-year-old Union veteran in 1927 when she was 18. Their wedding, according to family accounts, took place right in the middle of a dirt road, with family and friends gathered around about as informal a ceremony as you could imagine. She lived in the same small log cabin for nearly 70 years after his death in 1937, and continued receiving a government pension check every 2 months until her own death in 2003. Down in Arkansas, a woman named Maudie Hopkins married an 86-year-old Confederate veteran when she was 19 back in 1934, and reportedly kept the marriage quiet for years, worried about the kind of gossip that tends to follow a teenage bride and a man old enough to be her great-grandfather. She kept his memory and his pension paperwork alive until she passed away in 2008, a full century and a half after the war that made her a widow had technically ended. states eventually caught on to what was happening too. Arkansas passed a law in the 1930s specifically restricting which women could still claim a widow's pension through this kind of arrangement, an unusually direct legislative acknowledgement that people were in fact gaming a system originally built for something else entirely. Let's rewind now to how any of this became possible in the first place, because the scale of the original program is almost as staggering as its bizarre final chapter. The federal pension system for Union soldiers began in 1862, right in the middle of the war itself, initially covering veterans disabled in service, along with the widows, minor children, and dependent relatives of soldiers who died from war-related causes. Before the war, the entire cumulative pension system covering veterans and widows going all the way back to the Revolutionary War numbered around 25,000 people. Total, a program small enough that a handful of clerks could probably manage the paperwork over a long lunch. 20 years after the Civil War ended, that number had exploded to nearly 325,000 veterans, widows, and dependents on the rolls, a growth of roughly 4,000% in just 2 decades. By 1910, more than 90% of all living Union veterans were receiving some form of government assistance. This was not a small side program tucked away in a corner of the federal budget. For decades, it was one of the largest, most expensive obligations the entire government carried, consuming a truly enormous share of federal spending well into the 20th century, and widows made up a significant share of everyone receiving a check. Getting that check, though, was rarely as simple as it should have been, and I think this next part deserves real attention, because it is a completely different flavour of scrutiny than anything we have talked about so far tonight. A widow applying for a pension had to prove with documentation that she had been legally married to the soldier, that the marriage occurred before certain cut-off dates, written into whichever version of the law happened to be in effect at the time, and that she had not remarried since his death, since remarriage disqualified a widow from continued benefits for decades before the rules were finally softened. The government employed special examiners specifically to investigate suspicious claims, essentially professional skeptics whose entire job was determining whether a grieving woman's marriage and her grief itself was legitimate enough to deserve federal money. These examiners would interview neighbours, comb through old church and town records, and occasionally travel considerable distances just to confirm that a widow was in fact who and what she claimed to be. Picture that particular indignity for a second. Losing a husband to war and then having to sit across a table from a government investigator whose job is to decide whether your marriage was real enough to earn you compensation for that loss, all while raising children alone on whatever meagre income you had left in the meantime. This got especially complicated and especially unjust for a huge number of black widows applying for pensions connected to husbands who had served in the United States Colored Troops regiments that had fought and died for the Union in extraordinary numbers. Black soldiers had been eligible for pensions from the very start of the program, which was in fairness more inclusive than a great deal of the rest of federal policy at the time. But an enormous number of these men had married while they were enslaved in unions that held deep personal and community meaning, often celebrated with real ceremony among family and friends, but carried absolutely no legal standing whatsoever under the laws of the states where they had lived, since enslaved people were not permitted to enter into legally recognized marriage contracts at all. So the pension office found itself facing thousands of widows who were by any human measure truly and rightfully married, but who could produce no legal certificate proving it because no such certificate had ever been allowed to exist in the first place. The government eventually developed special procedures to accept testimony, instead allowing neighbours, former enslavers and fellow formerly enslaved people to vouch for the reality of a marriage that the law itself had refused to recognize while it was actually happening. It is a strange, quietly moving detail buried inside all this bureaucracy. A federal pension office of all institutions ended up being one of the first arms of the American government, forced to formally acknowledge that a marriage could be entirely real and legitimate, even when the law had never once agreed to call it one. I want you to sit with the sheer strangeness of the timeline here for a second, because I think it says something important about how societies decide who gets to be officially financially recognized as grieving. For an elderly rural widow, black or white, in say 1895, 30 years after her husband's death, this pension might have represented the single largest, most reliable source of income she had access to in her entire life, arriving steadily, month after month, from a government that otherwise offered women of that era almost nothing directly in their own name. No property rights worth mentioning if she happened to be still married rather than widowed, no vote, no direct legal standing. In most matters, no social safety net of any other kind waiting to catch her if her health failed or her crops did. Just this one check tied entirely and exclusively to her status as a widow, arriving with a regularity that most working people of that century, married or not male or female, could only have dreamed of. It is worth noting too that this entire federal system only covered widows of Union soldiers. Confederate widows lived under a completely separate patchwork arrangement, since the federal government refused understandably to pay pensions to veterans of a rebellion against it. Instead, individual former Confederate states eventually created their own pension programs, often decades later, and with far less funding, frequently requiring a widow to produce former comrades willing to formally vouch for her husband's honorable service. Getting that vouching could be complicated if the soldier in question had deserted, or simply had not fought with quite the unquestioning loyalty that community memory preferred to remember decades after the fact through the increasingly rosy lens of what historians now call the lost cause. Two widows, one from the north and one from the south, could have lost husbands in the exact same battle, and ended up navigating two entirely different bureaucracies, funded by two entirely different levels of government for the rest of their lives, which I think is exactly what eventually led to those strange 20th century marriages we started with tonight. By the 1920s and 1930s, with the country deep in economic hardship, a small number of very old Civil War veterans still remained alive, and a small number of much younger women recognized an opportunity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Marry a man in his 80s or 90s, care for him faithfully in whatever time he had left, and receive, in exchange, a guaranteed government pension as his widow for the rest of your own life, however long that turned out to be. Some of these arrangements were coldly transactional from day one. Others, according to surviving letters and interviews, grew into real affection and devoted caregiving even without romance in any traditional sense. Either way, it means the very last living connections to a war fought in the 1860s were still drawing government checks well into the 2000s, and in Helen Jackson's case into 2020 a year, most of us associate with entirely different headlines altogether. Here's the question I cannot stop turning over about all of this, and I would love to hear how you land on it. Is it strange, or is it actually kind of brilliant that a handful of clever, practical young women looked at a rigid, bureaucratic government system built around widowhood and found a completely legal way to bend it toward their own survival, using the exact same category of loss that had for the length of this entire story so often been used against women, and turning it quietly and legally into decades of guaranteed security instead? I do not think it is a coincidence that most of the women who made this choice were doing it during some of the hardest economic years in American history. When the ordinary paths to financial safety disappear, people get inventive about the paths that remain open, even when those paths run directly through somebody else's obituary. And somewhere in a government actuarial office decades ago, a very tired accountant almost certainly signed off on this entire pension system, assuming it would quietly wind down sometime around the 1920s, with absolutely no idea that a 17-year-old bride in 1936 was about to add another 84 years onto the government's tab. Not every widow's power in this era came stamped, filed and mailed out by a government office in careful monthly installments, though. Some of them built their power instead out of something the government could never issue or regulate at all. An invitation addressed by hand to the single most exclusive ballroom in the entire country. There was once a woman in New York so powerful that an entire social class was mathematically defined by the exact size of her ballroom, not by bloodline, not by any actual law, by square footage. Her name was Caroline Astor, and for close to 30 years she did not simply attend high society in America. She was the one deciding quite literally who was allowed to have a society at all, issuing invitations the way a monarch might issue decrees, and watching entire families rise or vanish from public relevance, based on nothing more than whether her handwriting appeared on a card sent to their front door. Here is where her story is going to do something a little different from everyone else we've talked about tonight, and I think it is worth calling out directly because it complicates the whole picture we've been building. Every widow we have covered so far found her power only after loss walking through a door that grief had accidentally left unlocked for her. Caroline Astor built her entire throne years before she ever became a widow in any legal sense at all. If anything, her husband's actual death arrived almost as an afterthought to a reign she had already been running for 2 decades, a footnote to a story that had already been written. Let's set the scene properly first. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into one of New York's oldest families, descendants of the original Dutch settlers of Manhattan, the kind of lineage that considered itself aristocracy in a country that officially did not have any. In 1853 she married William Backhouse Astor, the grandson of the man who had built the Astor family fortune through fur trading and New York real estate. It was by every honest account less a romance than a merger arranged with almost the same practical calculation you would expect from 2 companies deciding to combine forces. She brought centuries of respectable Dutch pedigree to the marriage, the kind of lineage no amount of Astor money could simply purchase outright. He brought an almost unimaginable amount of money wealth that could buy nearly anything else a family might want in 19th century New York. Her husband, for his part, showed little interest in society life, preferring to spend his time sailing often for months at a stretch, leaving his wife to build an entirely separate world, back on land largely without him, and by most accounts, without much complaint from either side of the marriage. That separate world truly began to take shape in 1872, when her mother-in-law died, making Caroline the senior surviving woman in the Astor family. She claimed the title everyone would eventually simply call her by for the rest of her life. The Mrs. Astor, no first name required, spoken as though there could only ever be one. From that point forward she built and enforced an entire social hierarchy in New York, almost single-handedly working alongside a social gatekeeper named Ward McAllister, to compile a list of exactly who counted as properly acceptable society in the city. That list became famous under a specific number. The 400, a figure McAllister reportedly landed on for the simple, almost comically practical reason that 400 was the maximum number of guests who could physically fit inside Caroline Astor's own ballroom. If your family could not squeeze into that room as far as fashionable New York was concerned, you effectively did not exist. Getting onto that list required more than money too, which is exactly what made her power so interesting to watch in action. One informal rule held that a family needed at least 3 generations of separation from whoever had originally made their fortune before they could be considered properly established rather than merely rich. It was old money's way of looking down at new money without ever having to say so directly, a polite unspoken test that conveniently happened to exclude almost every family that had gotten rich during the very economic boom that defined the era. It set up one of the great rivalries of the entire century when a spectacularly wealthy but still socially unproven family named Vanderbilt began trying to force their way into rooms Caroline Astor had no intention of opening for them, no matter how many railroads their fortune had built. The standoff between Caroline Astor and Alva Vanderbilt is honestly one of my favourite pieces of pure social theatre from this entire century, and I think it deserves a moment here because it shows exactly how this kind of unelected, unofficial power actually got wielded day to day. Caroline refused for years to formally call on Alva Vanderbilt, an old-fashioned but socially crucial gesture that functioned essentially as a stamp of approval. Without it, Alva's own daughter could never properly enter society either, since no respectable family would risk inviting a girl whose own mother had never been formally acknowledged. So Alva, rather than simply waiting for an invitation that clearly was never coming, threw an enormous, wildly extravagant costume ball, the kind of party the entire city would spend weeks talking about, and deliberately left Caroline Astor's own daughter off the guest list. Word spread quickly, and the reason was painfully obvious to anyone paying attention to the city's social rhythms. Caroline had never formally called on the Vanderbilts, so how could her daughter possibly be invited to their party, confronted with watching her own child excluded from the social event of the season over a technicality she herself had created? Caroline finally grudgingly paid the visit that etiquette required. The Vanderbilts were in. As Caroline herself reportedly put it afterward, the time had simply come for the Vanderbilts. One stubborn woman with an excellent party planner had outmaneuvered decades of old money exclusivity in a single evening, using nothing but a guest list as her weapon. Now here is where her story circles back around to everything we have spent tonight discussing, and where it gets truly strange once you look closely. In 1892, Caroline's husband William finally died alone of an aneurysm in a hotel room in Paris, an ocean away from the wife whose entire social empire he had funded but never once participated in. According to biographers who studied her private letters and household records, Caroline went into mourning largely, in their words, for the sake of proper form rather than any real depth of personal sorrow. Think about that for a second, sitting right alongside everything we discussed earlier tonight about the elaborate rules of Victorian mourning dress. Here was a woman putting on the exact same black crepe, observing the exact same calendar of restrictions, performing the exact same public ritual of grief that this whole society demanded of every widow for a marriage that had by most accounts been cordial at best for decades. The costume did not require the emotion underneath it to be real. It only required her to wear it correctly for the correct number of months, and everyone around her understood the difference perfectly well, without ever saying so out loud. It makes you wonder how many other widows we have discussed tonight, and how many more we have not wore that exact same uniform for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the person they had supposedly lost. The following year brought a loss that almost certainly cut far deeper, when her 34-year-old daughter Helen died from an overdose of laudanum, a widely used opiate tincture of the era prescribed for everything from nerves to a common cold. Caroline observed another period of mourning, then returned once again to the work of running her social empire, though several biographers note that the New York she came back to had already begun shifting. Beneath her growing, louder, more public, less interested in the rigid old-fashioned rules she had spent her whole adult life enforcing. A new generation of society women less concerned with three-generation pedigree tests, and considerably more comfortable being seen in public restaurants and hotels rather than only in private ballrooms, was already quietly rewriting the rules she had once controlled so completely. Her rivalry with her own extended family did not calm down with age either, and it produced maybe the single most spiteful architectural feud in New York City history. Her nephew William Waldorf Astor wanted his own wife recognized as the official Mrs. Astor instead of Caroline, and when Caroline refused to yield the title, he retaliated by tearing down his own father's mansion, which sat directly next door to hers, and replacing it with an enormous ornate hotel, specifically designed to overshadow her home in scale and grandeur. Caroline, entirely unbothered, reportedly dismissed the entire towering structure as nothing more than a glorified tavern, then calmly built herself an even larger mansion further up Fifth Avenue instead of dignifying the insult with a prolonged fight. If pettiness were an Olympic sport, this particular branch of the Astor family would have needed an entire trophy case, and Caroline, true to form, would have insisted on hosting the medal ceremony herself, with a strict guest list naturally. She kept hosting her legendary January balls for years afterward, culminating in one final grand event in January of 1905, receiving 800 guests dressed in purple velvet, trimmed with sable, wearing jewels rumoured to have once belonged to Marie Antoinette. It would be her last. Her health began declining soon after, and in 1908 she suffered a serious fall down her own marble staircase, striking her head badly enough that according to household accounts she was never quite the same afterward. In her final months, by most descriptions, her mind drifted steadily into the past, and she reportedly spent her mornings discussing dinner parties and guest lists for events that existed only in her own memory, greeting an empty house as though it were still filled with music and laughter, the way it had been for decades when her word alone decided who got to walk through the door. She died later that same year at 78 years old, having spent nearly 4 decades as the undisputed self-appointed monarch of a social kingdom that existed almost entirely because everyone else agreed to pretend it was real. I keep coming back to what her story actually proves, sitting right in the middle of everyone else we've talked about tonight. Every other widow in this story needed her husband's death to unlock the version of herself she eventually became. Caroline Astor built the entire architecture of her power, first using family seniority, generational wealth, and sheer force of personality, and simply wore widowhood afterward as one more costume in a wardrobe she'd already spent decades perfecting. Which makes me wonder something I would honestly love your take on. Was widowhood really the engine driving power for women in this era, or was it just the most visible, most easily told version of a much messier truth, that a small number of women found power through all sorts of different doors, and grief simply happened to be the door most of them were forced to use, while a select few, like Caroline, never needed a door at all, because they had already been handed the keys to the whole house? I think both things can be true at once, honestly. Widowhood opened doors for women who had nothing else working in their favour. It just was not apparently the only door in the building if you happened to already own the property. Not every powerful woman in this story got handed keys to anything, though. For every Caroline Astor commanding a ballroom full of the country's oldest names, there were countless other widows living lives so far outside that glittering world that history barely bothered writing their names down at all, and I think it is long past time we gave them equal space in this story tonight. Every widow we have met tonight so far had something extraordinary attached to her name. A mansion, a fortune, a newspaper masthead, a legend she spent decades polishing, a ballroom that decided who mattered in an entire city. Now, Let's talk about the ones who had none of that, because they were not the exception in this era. They were the overwhelming majority, and the glittering Gilded Age we have spent tonight exploring simply could not have functioned for a single day without their labour, most of it entirely unrecorded, unpaid, and unnamed. Every grand mansion needed someone scrubbing its floors. Every fortune needed someone laundering the shirts of the men who managed it. History remembers the woman who built the house. It almost never bothers remembering the widow who cleaned it. Here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath everything we discussed earlier about a widow's newfound legal freedom. All those rights, the ability to own property, sign a contract, run a business, stand in court as a full legal person, meant almost nothing to a woman who had no property, no business, and no money for a lawyer in the first place. Legal personhood is a wonderful thing to possess. It is considerably less useful when you possess absolutely nothing to attach it to. Freedom on paper and freedom in practice, it turns out, are two very different inheritances, and only one of them was ever handed out equally. So what did widowhood actually look like for the vast majority of women in this era? The ones who are not managing a Wall Street fortune or hosting 800 guests in a Fifth Avenue mansion. For most of them, it looked like an immediate, urgent scramble for income using one of a painfully short list of jobs society considered acceptable for a respectable woman to take on. She could work as a domestic servant in someone else's home, scrubbing floors and raising other people's children while her own waited for her at home, often in the care of an older sibling barely old enough for the responsibility herself. She could take in laundry, scrubbing other families' clothes by hand for pennies, a load, her own hands cracked and raw from lye soap and cold water by the end of most weeks. She could do piecework sewing, stitching garments at home for a wage so thin that entire families sometimes worked around the clock, children included, just to make rent on a single tenement room. Or, like Sarah Jane Robinson, whose darker story we already spent time on tonight, she could take in boarders renting out rooms in her own home to strangers just to keep the household afloat, an arrangement that, as we already learned, was not always as safe for the boarders as it should have been. These were not careers with advancement or dignity attached. They were survival dressed up in whatever respectability the neighbourhood was willing to grant a woman, working that hard just to keep her children fed one day, $1 one load of laundry at a time. The numbers on this, where records actually survive, are deeply sobering. Widowhood again and again shows up in the historical record of the era as one of the single most common paths into poverty for women and their children. Local almshouses and poorhouses across the country, the grim underfunded institutions of last resort for anyone who could no longer support themselves, counted widows among their most frequent residents, women who had simply run out of every other option available to them. And when a widowed mother truly could not keep her children fed and housed, an organization called the Children's Aid Society offered what looked on paper like mercy. Between 1854 and 1929, it placed roughly 200,000 children from struggling or single-parent families onto what became known as orphan trains, shipping them west by rail to be taken in and put to work on farms and in households across the country. Some of those children landed with truly loving families. Others became quite plainly unpaid labour for strangers sent hundreds of miles from a mother who had never actually stopped wanting them, but who simply had no way left to keep them. Now let's talk about an entire population of widows facing an even steeper set of obstacles, one we've only touched briefly tonight, and that deserves its own honest attention. In the years following emancipation, formerly enslaved women who lost husbands, whether to war, to violence, or simply to the ordinary business of dying, found themselves navigating a southern legal and economic system that was at almost every level actively working against them. Sharecropping contracts, the arrangement that replaced slavery across much of the rural South, were notoriously easy for landowners to manipulate, and a widow negotiating one of these agreements alone without a husband present to argue on the family's behalf was frequently shortchanged on her portion of the harvest, with essentially no functioning legal recourse available to her in practice, whatever rights she technically held on paper. Local courts, run almost entirely by white officials with little incentive to rule in her favour, offered a widow of colour the thinnest possible version of the legal personhood we spent so much time celebrating earlier tonight. She could in theory sue. In practice, in most of the rural South during this era, doing so successfully against a white landowner was close to unthinkable. Add to that the very real terrifying threat of racial violence targeting black families and black-owned property throughout this period, violence that could arrive with no warning and almost no consequence for the men responsible, and you get a version of widowhood carrying risks that a woman like Carolyn Astor worrying about ballroom guest lists never had to consider for a single moment of her entire life. A black widow in the post-war South was not simply fighting poverty. She was frequently fighting an entire system that had been rebuilt deliberately to make sure she never fully escaped it. I think it is worth pausing here and asking yourself something honestly. Every single woman we have spent tonight admiring the architect, the financier, the publisher, the myth maker, the society queen, even the poisoner in her own dark way, became memorable, specifically because her story survived. Somebody wrote it down. Somebody thought it was worth a newspaper column, a court transcript, a biography, a plaque outside a mansion that tourists still visit today. For every one of those women, there were countless others whose entire lives amounted to exactly the same kind of grit, the same stubborn refusal to simply disappear after loss, and whose names exist today only as a line in a census record if they exist at all. History did not forget them because their stories were less remarkable. It forgot them because nobody with the power to write things down thought a poor widow's survival was a story worth telling decade after decade in city after city, until the silence itself became the only record left of an entire class of women who held this whole era together with their own two hands. Immigrant widows faced their own particular version of this struggle, often compounded by a language barrier, unfamiliarity with American courts, and a community back home that was an ocean away and entirely unable to help. Many immigrant communities responded by building their own informal safety nets, mutual aid societies organized around a shared homeland church or trade, where members paid small regular dues in exchange for help if disaster struck, including often a modest payout to a widow left behind. We already met one particularly dark version of this kind of society earlier tonight, the same mutual aid insurance system that a certain poisoner learned to exploit for profit. It is worth remembering, though, that for the overwhelming majority of members, these societies worked exactly as intended, quietly holding together immigrant neighborhoods that the wider American legal and financial system had almost no interest in protecting on its own. There is, though, one truly hopeful thread running through this darker chapter, and I think it deserves real credit. By the early 1900s, reformers and lawmakers had started noticing just how directly widowhood was driving children into poverty orphanages and those overcrowded almshouses we mentioned a moment ago, and a growing number of them began arguing that shipping children off on trains to strangers was a fairly poor substitute for simply helping their own mothers keep them at home in the first place. In 1911, Illinois passed the first law in the country, creating what became known as a mother's pension, a small but steady public payment specifically designed to let a widowed mother keep her own children at home, rather than surrendering them to an institution simply because she could not afford to feed them alone. Other states followed quickly, and within about a decade the majority of the country had adopted some version of the same idea. It was modest, it was imperfect, and in practice it was often administered with plenty of judgmental scrutiny into whether a particular widow was, in the eyes of a local caseworker, respectable enough to deserve the help, a level of moral policing that should sound uncomfortably familiar after everything we've covered tonight about how closely this era liked to inspect a grieving woman's behaviour. But it planted an idea that had never really existed in American law before, that a widow's poverty was not simply her own private misfortune to endure quietly, but a problem the public itself had some real responsibility to help solve. It is in a fairly direct line one of the earliest ancestors of the broader social safety net that would eventually grow into something far larger, decades later in the wake of an even greater national economic collapse. I keep thinking about how strange it is that we know so much about Sarah Winchester's staircases or Hetty Green's oatmeal, and so little about the woman who might have scrubbed the floors in either of their households or washed the very morning dress hanging in a wealthier widow's closet. Would you have wanted your own name remembered if remembering it meant leaving behind the kind of evidence that only wealth scandal or tragedy tends to generate? Or would you have simply wanted to survive quietly unnoticed and let the history books chase somebody else's story? Instead, I do not think there is a wrong answer to that question. I just think it is worth asking because for the overwhelming majority of the widows who actually lived through this era, survival itself was already the entire achievement, with no mansion, no fortune and no lecture circuit required to make it count. If any of you watching tonight can trace your own family back far enough to find a widow nobody ever wrote a book about, I would truly love to hear a little about her in the comments. She deserves at least that much 100 and some years later. We have spent this whole night moving between mansions and courtrooms, boardrooms and seance parlours, ballrooms and poorhouses, government pension offices and orphan train platforms, following one single word through every single room in American life: widow. And underneath every version of that word we've uncovered tonight, wealthy or destitute, celebrated or completely forgotten, sat one particular piece of fabric that started this entire story, the very first thing we talked about hours ago now, and it is finally time we came back around to it and asked what it actually meant all along, underneath everything else we've learned since. So let's finally sit with that question, directly the one we've been circling all night without quite landing on. What did that black dress actually mean underneath everything we have uncovered together since we first stepped through Sarah Winchester's gates hours ago now, back when this was just one strange house and a woman the world had already decided to call mad? I think the honest answer is that it meant two completely opposite things at the exact same time, and both of them were true, which is probably why this story refused to sit still and behave itself for even one single chapter tonight. On one hand, it was a cage built out of fabric and etiquette manuals and centuries of quiet social pressure. A widow was expected to disappear into it, to shrink, to sit quietly in the dark for a year and a day, then another year after that, judged the entire time on whether her sorrow looked expensive enough, sincere enough, respectable enough for the neighbours watching from across the street. Remember the specific rules we walked through earlier tonight, the exact fabric, the exact veil, the exact number of months before a hint of grey was allowed anywhere near her collar. That part of the story is real, and it was cruel, and it should not be softened just because a happier ending eventually grew out of it for a handful of women. For every woman who found freedom underneath that veil, there were countless others who found only isolation, exhaustion, and a society perfectly content to let her disappear entirely quietly, without a single person ever noticing the difference. And on the other hand, hidden inside that exact same black fabric was the only key an enormous number of women in this era were ever legally handed in their entire lives. The instant the crepe went on, the law quietly did something it had refused to do for her during every single year of her marriage. It let her exist on paper as a full and complete person, own property, sign a contract, write a will that actually meant something, stand in a courtroom and be heard as herself, rather than as an extension of a husband who no longer had a vote in the matter, or any vote at all for that matter, being deceased. That is the whole story tonight, really compressed down into one dress and one law. And everything else we covered was simply different women discovering that same door standing open and choosing wildly different things to do once they walked through it. Sarah Winchester used it to build something with no blueprint and no permission, required a mansion that the world spent a century calling haunted, simply because nobody could think of another word for a woman that free. Nobody wanted to believe that a widow with no husband left to answer to might simply enjoy building, so they gave her ghosts instead, because ghosts at least made her strangeness make sense to a world that preferred its women legible. Hetty Green used that same freedom as camouflage, turning an outfit meant to make her disappear into a uniform so recognizable it made grown financiers nervous on Wall Street, proving along the way that patience and discipline could outperform every speculative man in the room decade after decade in a floor-length black dress. Nobody thought twice about looking directly at. Miriam Leslie went even further, taking the exact legal fusion that had once erased wives entirely, and choosing on her own terms to become her husband's name outright, then spending that borrowed identity's fortune trying to make sure no woman after her would ever need to borrow a man's name again just to be believed. Elizabeth Custer discovered that the same door could lead not to money, but to memory itself, spending 57 years quietly deciding how an entire country would remember one afternoon on a hillside in Montana, holding the gate on public criticism for longer than most empires managed to hold on to their own borders. Somewhere in the middle of all that inspiration sat a darker mirror of the same freedom, a woman who looked at insurance paperwork instead of opportunity and turned grief into a weapon aimed at her own family, a reminder that an open door tells you absolutely nothing about the character of whoever happens to be standing in front of it. Mediums built entire careers loaning grieving women, and occasionally themselves a voice nobody would have tolerated hearing plainly comfort and fraud, tangled together so tightly that separating them even now feels almost impossible. A government built one of its largest programs entirely around this one identity, and paid checks connected to a war fought in the 1860s, clear into the 21st century, into a world with smartphones and satellites still quietly settling accounts, opened generations before anyone alive today was born. Carolyn Astor showed us the door was not the only door in the building. If you already happened to own the house, using seniority and sheer force of personality to build a throne that never actually needed a husband's death to prop it up. And underneath every one of those stories sat the far larger, far quieter truth we sat with just a moment ago, that the overwhelming majority of women wearing that exact same black dress got none of the fortune, none of the fame, and none of the mercy, only the labour and the silence that history left in its place, scrubbing floors and taking in laundry while the mansions and ballrooms got all the ink. Here is the thing I keep returning to, and I think it might be the actual heart of everything we have spent tonight exploring together. The dress itself never made a single one of these women powerful. It only ever removed one obstacle, the legal fiction that had kept her invisible while she was married. What filled the space afterward, ambition or grief, or greed or love or simple relentless stubbornness, that part came entirely from each individual woman standing inside the black fabric. The freedom was identical. What people did with it never was. I think that is worth sitting with for a moment before we close things out tonight, because it still applies well beyond any Victorian morning dress. Most of us at some point get handed a door we did not ask for, a loss, an ending, a version of our life we never planned on living. The door itself does not decide what happens next. It just stands there open, waiting to see who we turn out to be once we finally step through it. Some of us will build a mansion. Some of us will simply survive the week, and that counts two more than we usually give ourselves credit for. None of us are wearing black crepe anymore, and thankfully nobody's measuring the width of the border on our stationery to judge how deeply we're allowed to feel something. But I think most of us know exactly what it feels like to be handed a version of freedom we never actually wanted, the kind that only shows up disguised as a loss. A job that ends badly and forces a fresh start nobody asked for. A relationship that closes one door precisely so a completely different one can finally open. Grief, in whatever shape it visits your own life, tends to work the exact same way it worked for every widow we met tonight. It rarely feels like liberation while you're standing inside it. It only starts to look like a door rather than simply a wall much later, usually only once you've already found the nerve to walk through it and discovered something waiting for you on the other side that you never could have built while everything familiar was still standing. It is worth mentioning too, before we let this story rest for the night, just how far this particular fascination has travelled since the last of these women closed her own front door for the final time. Sarah Winchester's strange, sprawling mansion is still standing in California today, still drawing curious visitors by the thousands every year, and it inspired a feature film a few years back that leaned heavily into the ghost story, rather than the far more interesting truth we spent our first hour together untangling. The wealthy, mysterious widow, equal parts pitied and feared, equal parts victim and suspect, has never really left popular imagination at all. She shows up in period dramas set in this exact same era, in true crime documentaries about poisoners not so different from the one we discussed tonight, in every single story that still cannot quite decide whether a woman in black mourning clothes deserves our sympathy or our suspicion. We built this whole video around one specific slice of American history, but honestly I do not think we ever really stopped telling this story. We just keep finding new women to tell it about generation after generation, as though we still have not quite finished deciding what to make of her. I want to thank you sincerely for spending this much of your evening here with me tonight, walking through mansions and courtrooms and seance parlours and poorhouses, sitting with some truly difficult history alongside some truly remarkable people. Stories like this take a considerable amount of time and care to put together properly, digging through old court records, biographies and newspaper archives to make sure what you heard tonight was not just a good story, but an accurate one, and the fact that you stayed with me through every single one of these women, the builders and the survivors and the ones who never got a fair chance at either, means more than you probably realize. If tonight's story kept you company, or gave you something worth thinking about as you drift off, I would love it if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe for more of these deep, slow, thoroughly researched dives into the stranger corners of history. It truly helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might need exactly this sort of quiet company at the end of a long day. And if there is a particular woman we talked about tonight who stuck with you, whether it was the architect building her own escape one room at a time, the financier nobody thought to take seriously, the forgotten laundress history never bothered to name, or the queen who never even needed to lose anyone to build her throne, drop a comment below and let me know which one you cannot stop thinking about. Tell me too where you are tucked in tonight listening to all of this. I read every single comment, and honestly, those conversations are usually where I find the seed of whatever story comes next. Speaking of what comes next, there are a great many more strange, quiet corners of history still waiting for us. Other women, other doors, other stories, just as strange as anything we covered together tonight. and I would love for you to be here when we open the next one together. History, it turns out, has an almost bottomless supply of people who deserved a better memory than the one we gave them, and I intend to keep digging until we have given as many of them as possible their moment back in the light, even if that light only ever reaches you through a screen at midnight. Until then, let the light stay low a little longer, let the fan keep humming if you left it running, and let your mind settle wherever it wants to go tonight, whether that is straight into sleep or just into a little quiet, thinking about doors and dresses and everything a person can build once the world finally stops telling her to sit still. Thank you again truly for spending tonight's story with me. Sleep well.